All right, today we're going to try to break down the nervous system. This is a network of neurons that are able to help generate, modulate, and transmit information between the different parts in the body. The properties of the nervous system allow functions of things like regulation of heartbeat, breathing, digestion, sensation, and body movements. Nervous system structures preside over everything that makes us human: our consciousness, cognition, behavior, and memories. The nervous system is involved in almost everything we do, from how we're able to see things to how we're able to walk or talk. And it's divided into two parts: the central nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is then divided into the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems. So we have this complex, organized nervous system that receives information from those sensory organs and transmits it through the nerves and through the spinal cord, and then processes it in the brain. It's going to direct the body's reaction to external stimuli. It controls most of our internal functions, everything from muscle movement and blood vessel dilation to how we learn. It does all this through those impulses that it sends, those messages, both electrical and chemical, between our cells. So within that nervous system, we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Your central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord. Your peripheral nervous system is going to be comprised of your cranial and your spinal nerves, some sensory neurons, and neuromuscular junctions, as well as the ganglia. All right, these ganglia are just these nerve cell bodies that help produce the signal, okay, or help produce the response, sort of a relay station. Together, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system help transmit all those impulses throughout the body. So sensory information, they're going to coordinate body functions. The brain and the spinal cord are that control center, and they're just receiving data and feedback from the sensory organs out there in the body, from the nerves in the body, and then they process that information. It goes back to the brain where commands are sent out. Now, these nerve pathways carry ingoing and outgoing signals. This information is sent out through afferent and efferent, okay? Afferent and efferent divisions that are within that body. Now, afferent is going to bring sensory information from outside to the central nervous system. This includes things like your visual receptors, your auditory receptors, your chemoreceptors, and your somatosensory or touch receptors. The efferent will bring motor information from the central nervous system out to the periphery or the body. So this would result in things like contraction of the skeletal muscles to trigger movement in the somatic nervous system, contraction of the smooth muscles to conduct some sort of activity for those internal organs through the autonomic nervous system. So we have afferent, which are those incoming, and those are sensory, and efferent, which are those exiting or outgoing, and those are going to be motor. We also have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that connect the brain to the eyes, the ears, and the other sensory organs, and to the head and the neck muscles. We have 31 pairs of spinal nerves that will branch out from that spinal cord, and they're correlated with each nerve in the body, and they help relay different information out by sending motor commands, sensory commands, or both. The peripheral nerves also have nerve fibers that help carry different stimuli from those sensory receptors and from your internal and external environment to the central nervous system. Again, afferent or incoming sensory will carry information from the central nervous system out to the effector or efferent nerve fibers, which will conduct that motor action. Brain communication and control centers in the body help evaluate the input and decide what kind of action or response it wants to take, and then they initiate that action. And this occurs through involuntary activity required to maintain homeostasis, and also the autonomic nervous system through the actions of the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. Voluntary actions are controlled by the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system can involve things that you consciously do. Your autonomic nervous system works without you thinking about it. So it's running behind the scenes to keep you alive, doing all those things that you're not routinely thinking about and don't have control over. So that involuntary movement. Different signals are sent by the brain, and these control different processes. Your brain interprets them. Some will make you feel tired. Some might make you feel pain. Some messages stay in the brain, and they're relayed through the spine, right through those 31 nerves in the spinal cord that I talked about, and out to the extremities. The central nervous system relies on billions of neurons to make this action happen. Reflexes are automatic. These are rapid, involuntary responses to a stimuli. Like when you touch a pan, you burn your hand, you pull the hand away immediately. You don't think about it, that just happens automatic. Okay, a lot of reflexes that control your visceral or your activities of your organ or things like your posture will happen without you even being aware of it. The autonomic response or the visceral response occurs through involuntary action, okay, and it's controlled by activity of the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And that system is made up of the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. Your autonomic nervous system. All right, so you have 3 layers of meninges in your brain. The dura mater, which is your tough outer layer, that's going to help cover the brain and the spinal cord. It's close to the bone, and it separates from the dural sinuses. So the dural sinuses help collect the cerebral spinal fluid for sending it back into the circulation. The subdural space is right below the dura, and it's space that's usually empty. However, if there was an injury like a head injury, then blood can collect in that area. You also have the arachnoid or the arachnoid matter, and this is that spider-like, web-like covering in the middle layer. We have the subarachnoid space. This is where the cerebral spinal fluid collects. The cerebral arteries and the veins lie here beneath the arachnoid. We have the arachnoid villi. These are little finger-like projections around the brain, and here cerebral spinal fluid can be reabsorbed and put back into circulation. We have the pia mater, and this is very close. This is the innermost layer, okay, and that is going to contain a lot of the blood vessels for the brain here. The meninges of the central nervous system has 3 layers. These cover and protect the brain and the spinal cord. All right, so dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater, all are going to anchor your brain and provide blood vessels, nerves, lymphatics, and cerebral spinal fluid for your central nervous system. The cerebral spinal fluid has a lot of nutrients that the brain is able to use. It also will support and cushion the brain and protect it from sudden movement. The choroid plexus is what produces that cerebral spinal fluid in the ventricles of the brain. Cerebral spinal fluid must be replaced every few hours. It takes away the waste, and it has to be produced and reabsorbed in equal amounts. It should be clear and colorless. It looks something like plasma, but it has a little bit different concentration in there. So you'll see electrolytes, glucose, and protein, and some occasional white blood cells. It's slightly acidic with a pH of 7.32 to 7.35. Anything else in the cerebral spinal fluid would be an indication of a problem. For example, if you saw erythrocytes or red blood cells in there, then that may indicate some sort of bleeding or hemorrhage in the brain. All right, so things that you really want to remember is that it flows through the subarachnoid space. It's produced in the choroid plexus. What is in it? It's also used to diagnose, so we can use that fluid to analyze, diagnose, and look at specific diseases of the central nervous system, brain hemorrhages, cancers of the brain. We do that through a lumbar puncture, also known as a spinal tap. The CSF is, or the cerebrospinal fluid, is then analyzed for pressure. So we need to know that that pressure remains constant. Excess pressure could cause some sort of hemorrhage in the brain with the brainstem or other parts of the brain. We look at the appearance. It should be clear, not cloudy, indicating infection. Protein levels that are in excess could indicate some sort of cancer. Glucose is energy for the brain, so we need that in there. We look at the white blood cell count. If it's too high, then possibly infection. If there was red blood cells in there, again, bleeding. We also can identify certain cells in there, and then we can culture it to look for bacteria or other infectious organisms. The choroid plexus is a really vascularized area of the tissue, and it's located in the ventricles, the third and fourth ventricles. This area is going to constantly produce that cerebral spinal fluid. So that might be a question since I keep saying it over and over. The cerebral spinal fluid is going to flow into the subarachnoid space then and circulate around the brain and the spinal cord, and eventually to go into the arachnoid villi where it'll be absorbed and put back into circulation. All right, the anterior portions of the choroid plexus are supplied by internal carotid arteries, and those internal carotid arteries help control pressure within the brain and help send signals out if there's a problem. Characteristics of normal cerebral spinal fluid include glucose, protein, lipids, electrolytes. All these provide nutrition to the central nervous system. You should also find some occasional white blood cells, but nothing else. And again, it's going to be slightly acidic. And if you look at the chart below from your book, it'll list all the characteristics there. Protection of the brain. So we have a blood-brain barrier, and that helps prevent things from entering the brain. So we have an impermeable capillary there, which makes it very hard for anything to go into that area. Anything that might be harmful to the brain, any sort of germs. The cells of the capillaries are very tightly bound together, and that limits any potentially damaged material from entering into that brain. And the brain barrier also helps control the balance of the electrolytes and the glucose and the proteins in the brain as well. There is a similar blood cerebral spinal fluid barrier at the choroid plexus, and that helps control nutrients in the cerebral spinal fluid. In infants, there is a poorly developed blood-brain barrier, and so things like bilirubin or other toxic materials are able to easily go into the baby's brain and cause damage. When the blood-brain barrier is fully developed, it can be a disadvantage because there are certain drugs that we may need to use to treat something, and they're not able to cross over this barrier so that they can help the client, like certain antibiotics and certain cancer drugs. Things like alcohol, which are lipid soluble, are able to freely pass into that brain. And so that can be a factor when you see some of these young kids at these parties and they drink back-to-back shots, how they get this toxic condition and they actually die because, it impairs the central nervous system and they die from really essentially overdose of alcohol. You do have those cerebral hemispheres. They make up the largest part of the brain. There's a longitudinal fissure that divides the left from the right. And then we have 4 major lobes. Each of those have specific functions. The diencephalon is the center portion of the brain, and it's surrounded by those hemispheres. It has the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus housed in it. The brainstem connects the brain to the spinal cord, and it consists of 3 parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum is also there, and it's located near the pons and the medulla, below the occipital lobe. The main parts of the brain: there are 3 main parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. All right, so the cerebrum, the cerebellum, this is located at the back, below the cerebrum. It's going to help with voluntary movement like posture, balance, coordination, speech, and damage here is going to cause a problem with balance or movement and coordination, muscle coordination, known as ataxia. Then the brainstem, that's in the lower part, all right, and that's going to help connect the spinal cord. It includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. That's going to control your vital functions. So life-sustaining functions like heart rate, breathing, sleeping, eating, those kind of things. Damage here can result in life-threatening conditions like breathing difficulties, cardiac issues, loss of consciousness. The cerebrum are the 2 cerebral hemispheres, the right and the left, that form that large part of the brain. Again, each hemisphere is in 4 major lobes. Each one has a specific function. It has gray matter there and white matter there. Gray matter forms the surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and it's associated with processing and cognition. That is known as the cerebral cortex. The white matter forms the deeper part of the brain. There are glial cells and myelinated axons there that help connect the gray matter areas. And the cerebrum then has the sulci, the grooves, and the gyri. The cerebral cortex is classified in 4 lobes according to the name of the corresponding cranial bone. And it's responsible for that higher brain function, including thought, action, emotion, interpretation of sensory data as well. Damage to that cortex, depending on the area, would cause things like memory loss, impaired cognitive skills, changes in your personality, loss of motor control. The right and left hemispheres are similar in structure, but they function differently. The dominant hemisphere of the brain is the side that controls our language, and that's mostly the left hemisphere. Most people, it's going to be the left hemisphere. This left hemisphere, is also responsible for mathematical problem solving, logical reasoning abilities, The right hemisphere has greater influence on artistic, creativity, spatial relationships, emotional, and behavioral characteristics. Also located in the left side are those two special areas, Broca, which is responsible for the expressive speech, meaning how we produce it, how we say it, control of those muscles. And then Wernicke's is the integration center that helps us comprehend the language. So how we understand our language, both written and spoken. If these areas don't function, like if Broca's area doesn't function, the client wouldn't be able to talk because they can't produce the language. If Wernicke's area were affected, the client wouldn't be able to comprehend the language. Both hemispheres are concerned with voluntary movement and sensory function, but on the opposite side or the contralateral side of the body. So the left hemisphere would control the right side of the body and receive information from areas like the right visual field, controlling speech, language, recognition of words, letters, and numbers. The right hemisphere would control the left side of the body, receiving information from the left visual field, controlling creativity, context, recognition of faces, places, objects. The prefrontal cortex is going to be at that frontal lobe right behind the forehead. It's going to help affect your behavior, personality, and ability to plan. This is where executive function or the ability to self-regulate and planning ahead occurs. It also helps provide expression of your personality, and it plays a significant role in social relationships and impulse control. Also here is the basal nuclei, known as basal ganglia, and these are neuron cell bodies or gray matter in the tracts of the cerebral hemisphere. They're part of the EPS system, so this is going to be your motor control, and it controls and coordinates skeletal muscle activity. It helps prevents excessive movement. It helps initiate accessory and involuntary actions, such as when we swing our arms, like when we're walking. Ganglia themselves are just nerves or brain cells that are closely related. They may have some of the same connections. They work together and they're part of the nervous system. The basal ganglia help with how your body moves. So this is helping your brain control your body movements. And they're part of the network of the brain cells and nerves that control the body's voluntary movement. The basal ganglia can approve a signal that can continue to the motor pathway, to the nerves, and eventually carry that signal down the spinal cord and to the destination muscle. If the signal isn't approved, then it would be redirected to another area until it stops. Basal nuclei or basal ganglia are part of the EPS system, which includes pathways in the central nervous system that help control involuntary movement and help maintain posture. The extrapyramidal system is actively involved in promoting and selecting active voluntary movement along with the coordination of that movement. And this system helps regulate involuntary movement or reflexes. Main components of the extrapyramidal system are the nuclei of the basal ganglia and additional nuclei located in the midbrain called substantia nigra, and red nucleus also are connected and help with the extrapyramidal system. The limbic system helps with emotions, all right, and this is located in the cerebral hemisphere, all right. It's responsible for emotional reactions, feelings. It has connections to a lot of different areas of the brain. And then cognitive intellectual decisions arising from the higher cortical centers can be accompanied by emotional aspects that are mediated through that limbic system. Part of the hypothalamus is also involved with the limbic system, and the hypothalamus provides a link for autonomic responses, such as alterations in blood pressure or nausea whenever a person experiences something like fear, excitement, or they see something unpleasant or they smell something unpleasant. The diencephalon is that center portion of the brain. It's surrounded by the hemispheres. It holds the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The thalamus is the part of the brain that relays the sensory information coming from those afferent motors, and it sends it to the part of the brain that would then trigger that motor signal that's going to carry out that action, go to that basal ganglia because that's going to help with that movement or that action, and that relay station, all right? So we have the incoming sensory or the afferent fibers that are transmitting information to that cerebral cortex and other areas of the brain, and the thalamus is connected with all parts of the central nervous system, including the brainstem and the cerebral cortex. So it can influence different parts in the brain. The hypothalamus helps with maintaining homeostasis, controlling the autonomic nervous system, and a lot of the endocrine system. It's also responsible for regulating body temperature, for our appetite, intake and outtake of food, regulation of sleep. It also plays a key role in stress response and roles in the emotional responses through the limbic system, also in biological behaviors and in our sex drive. The hypothalamus performs many of its homeostasis balancing jobs, directly influencing the autonomic nervous system or by managing different hormones in the body. The hypothalamus can also make hormones that are stored elsewhere, like your posterior pituitary gland, or what I call your PP gland, where your ADH is stored. It can send hormones to the pituitary glands to either release the hormones that can affect some part of your body or send a signal to a hormone to a different gland in your body that releases its hormone. So, for example, the hypothalamus can send a signal to the posterior pituitary gland or the PP gland to release something called ADH, right? Antidiuretic hormone, meaning that if you were suddenly becoming dehydrated or something like that, the body could release this ADH right through the hypothalamus and the PP or posterior pituitary gland, and that's going to control the amount of water that's either excreted or, in this case, reabsorbed, because if you're becoming dehydrated, the body would want to retain fluid to prevent that, and your thirst signal would trigger you would become thirsty if you were becoming dehydrated. That would trigger that hypothalamus, which would cause that posterior pituitary gland to then release that ADH and signal the body to stop sweating as much, stop releasing as much fluid, all right, so that it can retain some of that fluid and protect you. The hypothalamus also sends signals in the form of releasing hormones to tell the anterior and posterior pituitary gland when to secrete those hormones. The epithalamus works with the limbic system, and so it helps connect that limbic system to other parts of the brain. Again, the hypothalamus does a lot of different things, so it's going to help process the signals from the thermoreceptors to help maintain temperature in the body through the processes of shivering or sweating. It also will take charge of the autonomic nervous system and control things like cardiovascular activity, exocrine gland secretions within the digestive system and the skin. Smooth muscle contractions in those organs. It also helps regulate activity of the endocrine system through producing different hormones, and it does that just like we talked about through that pituitary gland. It produces feelings of hunger to signal the stomach, and then it generates through osmoreceptors in the it generates thirst through osmoreceptors that are located in that hypothalamus. Also, low water content, so it'll produce feelings of thirst. And it'll give us the desire to want to drink. It also works with the hippocampus. Remember I said that hippocampus is that giant hippo that walks around campus. That's where all your memories are stored. So it works with that to help you, form and retain new memories. It also can generate different reactions in the body in response to your emotions in connection with the limbic system. So this can also cause changes in the body. You have this emotion, like you get angry, and all of a sudden your blood pressure and your heart rate goes up. It can help control your circadian rhythm, which is part of your sleep-wake cycle, and it does this through exposure to light as a stimulus because of the communication between the hypothalamus and the pineal gland in the epithalamus. It also can help produce the activity in the reward pathways of the brain so that certain actions cause experience of pleasure, and that can motivate us to do other things like eat, engage in sexual activity. It can also sometimes have some negative effects. So we look at some of this activity in the brain and addiction, because for people that are addicted, when they take the drug, they get the action of that reward pathway. And so the body wants them to bring that reward back again. That's the same motivation that we see in eating or sexual activity. You get pleasure out of eating, you get pleasure out of engaging in that sexual activity, and so the body wants you to do it again. All right, this chart is in your book, and it shows the different areas of the brain and the functions of the body and how they assist with those different functions. The reticular activating system, this is located in the brain stem. This is your arousal. Okay, so this is going to help you keep awake and aroused, and it's going to determine the degree of arousal or awareness. Sometimes drugs can affect this, okay? So these neurons can also help decide whether or not they want to receive different impulses coming into the brain. They can determine which sensory impulses they want to accept or ignore. Again, different drugs can have effect on this. Your reticular activating system helps make sure that the brain doesn't have to process more data than it can actually handle as well. All right, the brain stem, that's connecting your brain to your spinal cord, and it's part of your central nervous system. It houses the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And these components all have their own structure and function, and they help really sustain life by regulating our breathing, our heart rate, our blood pressure. A lot of other functions as well, but those are the main ones that support life, right? So the midbrain, that is the top part, and it helps regulate eye movement. The pons is the middle part. It's like a bridge, and it helps coordinate facial movement, hearing, and balance. And the medulla oblongata is the bottom part, and it's going to help regulate breathing, heart rhythms, blood pressure, and swallowing. Also, the brain stem has that reticular activating system that is going to control your sleep-wake cycle and your levels of alertness and arousal to your surroundings. Your brainstem also has 10 of the 12 cranial nerves that control your face, your sensation, and your taste. Later on, we'll talk about there's a lot of neurons in the face, the hands, and part of that is because of, the unique movements that it does have to do. The midbrain is associated with vision, hearing, motor control, your sleep-wake cycle, your arousal, alertness, your temperature. One structure in the midbrain is that reticular activating system. Again, that is for your level of arousal and alertness of the cerebral cortex. The pons is a bundle of afferent and efferent fibers. So those are the incoming sensory fibers and the efferent or the outgoing motor fibers. And it acts as a bridge between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. There are several nuclei located there for cranial nerves that are also located in that pons. It plays an important role in the autonomic nervous system, and it also offers a route for signals to travel to and from the brain. Injuries in the pons could impair cranial nerve function associated with that part of the brainstem, and this could cause damage to facial sensations, eye movements, hearing, taste, and more. The medulla oblongata contains the centers that regulate respiratory and cardiovascular function, and also the centers that govern your cough reflexes, swallowing, and vomiting. The location of the nuclei of several cranial nerves is in that medulla oblongata. It manages the heart, circulation, and breathing, and this is where the cardiovascular and respiratory systems come together to control that heart rate, the breathing, the blood pressure, and more. It manages other automatic processes, things that the body does without having to think about them. Some of those already mentioned, like coughing, sneezing, vomiting, maintaining balance. It helps maintain balance along with the inner ear. There are several nerve connections that converge at the spine to carry signals back and forth from the spine to the brain, and those signals pass through the medulla oblongata. Several of the cranial nerves also connect through the medulla. There is a crossover point known as the pyramids or the corticospinal tracts, and this is where the nerves in the body crisscross, and that crossover is why one side of the brain always controls the opposite or the contralateral side of the brain. The medulla, again, is that location of the region called the pyramids. This is where most of the movement related to the nerves in the body crisscross, producing that contralateral effect. This is also known as the corticospinal tract. So these pyramid tracts extend through the brainstem and the spinal cord to carry voluntary motor output from the cerebrum to the spinal cord. That cortical spinal tract, also known as the pyramidal tract, is a collection of axons that carry movement-related information from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, forming the descending part of the spinal tract, meaning those signals are going to move from here down. It's one of the major pathways that carry movement-related information to the brain, to the spinal cord, and the neurons travel in the cortical spinal tract are referred to as upper motor neurons. They synapse on the neurons in the spinal cord called lower motor neurons, and these are going to help make the skeletal muscle contract these two actions. Now, decussation of the pyramids, most of the pyramidal fibers will cross over to the opposite side of the brain, and that helps each cerebral hemisphere control voluntary movement in the opposite side of the brain. So this decussation really just means the crossing of the right and left cortical spinal tracts that occur in the body. The cerebellum, which is located near the pons and the medulla, coordinates movement through posture and equilibrium and by adjusting to input from the pyramidal system in the proprioceptors in the joints and the muscles, the visual pathways, and the vestibular pathways from that inner ear. People with this kind of damage will usually have a problem with keeping their balance while standing or walking, or they may have trouble reaching for objects because their hands might miss the object they're trying to pick up. Damage could also make it harder for someone to learn new words or skills. Damage to the cerebellum can interfere with judgment when it comes to the size or the distance we are from objects. It can also interfere with our judgment and sense of timing. Blood supplied by the brain to the brain by the internal carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. Each internal carotid artery is part of the common carotid artery, the left or right, and includes the carotid sinus, which is where the baroreceptors are. These can detect changes in the blood pressure and the chemoreceptors, so they can easily detect changes in the pH and the oxygen level. At the base of the brain, we have these internal carotid arteries that are divided into anterior and middle cerebral arteries. The anterior cerebral artery helps supply the frontal lobe. The middle cerebral artery would supply the cerebral hemisphere, mostly the temporal and the parietal lobe, and then the vertebral arteries will join. And they will form the basilar artery that supplies the brain stem and the cerebellum. At the base of the brain, that basilar artery will then divide into right and left posterior cerebral arteries, supplying the occipital lobe. The anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral arteries will also branch out and penetrate into the brain. Anastomosis will occur between the major arteries in the brain. And it does this, okay, at something called the circle of Willis. So the circle of Willis is this area in the brain where the arteries join, and they do this to help provide an alternative source of blood when the internal carotid or vertebral artery is obstructed for some reason. These arteries surround the pituitary gland and the optic chiasm. The main function of that circle of Willis is to provide collateral blood flow between the anterior and posterior arterial system of the brain, and it supplies an alternate blood flow between the right and left cerebral hemisphere. The circle of Willis actually protects the brain from ischemia and stroke in case of some sort of obstruction or damage. The anastomotic circle connects the two major arterial systems to the brain, the internal carotid arteries and the vertebrobasilar arteries. Blood flow in those cerebral arteries is relatively constant. The brain constantly uses the oxygen and glucose, which is essential for the neurons to survive. There's little storage capacity there. Autoregulation helps with this process by the body recognizing increased levels of carbon dioxide or decreased levels of pH in the blood or a decreased blood pressure in the brain, and this results in the body producing immediate vasodilation. Baroreceptors or chemoreceptors help protect the brain from damage whenever there's an abnormal blood pressure or a pH level change in the blood flow. The venous blood that comes from the brain will collect in those dural sinuses and drain into the right and left internal jugular veins, and then it's returned to the heart. We have 12 cranial nerves, and they are paired to rise directly from the brain. They originate from the brain stem, and pass through the foramina in the skull, and they serve the structures in the head and the neck, including the eyes and the ears. The first two nerves are the olfactory and the optic, and they come from the cerebellum, and then the other 10 come from the brain stem. The names of the cranial nerves relate to the function, and they're numerically identified in Roman numerals. Each cranial nerve can be described as either sensory afferent incoming or motor efferent outgoing, or both. There are 4 cranial nerves which are considered parasympathetic nerves: 3, 7, 9, and 10. This is just a list of all the different cranial nerves and how they are in the body. You won't have to memorize these, okay? But at some point you will, so you might want to start working on that now. You should know what the cranial nerves are. This is just a little mnemonic to help you try to remember them, the order and the sequence. All right, The spinal cord is continuous with the brain, transmitting that sensory information from the periphery of the body up to the brain, and the motor information from that brain back out to the periphery. It's also a place where coordination of the reflexes occurs, as well as control of the reflexes independently from that brain. Along the spinal cord, there are spinal nerves that carry both sensory and motor information. The spinal nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system, and they are the structures through which the central nervous system receives the sensory information from the periphery. Remember, from external stimuli to the periphery of the body, and then through the activity of the trunk and the limbs is going to be eventually regulated. They also transmit motor commands from the central nervous system to the muscles of the periphery, and they're composed of motor and sensory fibers, autonomic fibers, 31 pairs of nerves that come from the spinal cord through the vertebral canal. Spinal cord is going to be protected by that bony vertebrae, the meninges, and cerebral spinal fluid, and it's continuous with the medulla oblongata, ending at the first lumbar vertebrae. Beyond that is a bundle of nerve roots known as the cauda equina, and this is important because there's little risk of damaging the cord when we go into the subarachnoid space there below the first lumbar level between L3 and L4 to get our sample of cerebral spinal fluid if we needed to analyze it for some reason. Also, we have gray matter, which includes those horns, the anterior horns, which house the cell bodies of the motor neurons, the posterior horns, which house the interneurons, and these are those association neurons, and then the lateral horns, which house those visceral motor neurons. So here is a picture of the spinal cord, and it's showing you the cranial nerves that are affected by the parasympathetic, the phrenic nerve, which is used to control the diaphragm and respiration, intercostal muscles for respiration, your sympathetic nervous system for your heart, your blood vessels, and your temperature, and your parasympathetic, which controls the bowel, bladder, and external genitalia there. So you might just want to take a look at like what coordinates with what matches up with what there, what controls what area. The spinal cord is used to conduct impulses from the brain to the body, generate reflexes to help make our body function smoothly. And it consists of white matter, which is that myelin sheath, okay, which is going to help to conduct the impulses, and the gray matter that contains those nerve cell bodies, the dendrites, and those non-myelinated axons that are going to also help control and regulate those impulses. Within the gray matter, though, those horns are going to be, okay, the ventral horn, which has those motor neurons, the dorsal horn, which has those interneurons, and they are receiving information from those sensory neurons, and then the lateral horns, which contain the visceral motor neurons. So tracts, these are nerve fibers that pass through the spinal cord, and they're known as the tracts of the spinal cord. We have the ascending tract, and then we have the descending tract, which contains the pyramid and the extrapyramidal tract. The ascending tract is the pathway through which the sensory information from the peripheral nerves is sent up to the cerebral cortex. And the descending tract comes from the brain into the spinal cord to send out that motor action, or the efferent signal, efferent. The descending tracts are the pyramidal or the corticospinal tracts, which conduct the impulses concerned with the voluntary movement from those upper motor neurons to the lower motor neurons in the anterior horn at the level of the spinal cord that coordinates with it. So most of those tracts are going to cross in the medulla, we talked about that decussation where they cross over. The extrapyramidal tracts will carry impulses that modify and coordinate the voluntary movement, help us maintain posture. Lower motor neurons can receive both stimulatory and inhibitory input from the upper motor neurons and from the inner neurons in the spinal cord, and these will help determine activity in the nerves and the skeletal muscle. The ascending tracts are going to send information from the periphery to the brain, and the descending tracts carry the information from the brain out to the body to conduct the motor action. In the gray matter, you have those horns, okay? Ventral horn has the motor neurons. The dorsal horns have those inner neurons that's getting that sensory information. And the lateral horns have the visceral neurons. The white matter, again, is the afferent and efferent fibers. This is that myelinated area, and it's sending those impulses back and forth. 31 pairs of spinal nerves emerge from the spinal cord, and they carry out the motor and sensory fibers to and from the organs and tissues of the body. And they're named by the location where they emerge from, and they're numbered within each section. For example, there's 8 pairs of cervical nerves numbered C1 to CH, and each nerve is connected to the spinal cord by the 2 roots. The spinal nerves would leave the spinal cord between the vertebrae. The white matter has the myelinated axons of neurons, and it tracks between the white matter and the brain to conduct sensory information. Ascending tracts will carry the impulses from the spinal cord to the brain, and descending would carry the impulses from the brain to the spinal cord. Spinal nerves and cranial nerves can be afferent. They can carry information from the body to the brain, sensory, or efferent, carrying information back from the brain to the muscles and the glands, causing that movement. So they can also be mixed. They can be made of both. All right, so we also have sensory information being carried by the afferent axons of the spinal nerves, and they can enter into the cord. The afferent nerve endings related to the senses are divided into special and general. The special senses are the olfaction, the vision, the hearing, the balance, and the taste. The motor commands that are carried out by the efferent axons leave the cord, all right, and they communicate with muscles and glands. They release different neurotransmitters into the nerve endings on the target cells, and then that elicits that desired response. A dermatome, this is a special area of skin supplied by a single spinal nerve. So when we look at sensory awareness, we use something called a dermatome map, and this helps determine level of damage in the spinal cord. Each dermatome in the map is associated with a single spinal nerve, and the nerves transmit specific sensations such as pain from a certain area of the skin to the central nervous system. These dermatomes help because they can help assess and diagnose a variety of conditions. For example, symptoms that occur along a specific dermatome or nerve line that we would call it indicate a problem with a specific nerve in the spine. So shingles is an example of this. All right, so someone has this activation of shingles in the body, it's usually going to run along the nerve line. And then we'll have pain or a rash along a specific dermatome or nerve line that's associated with the affected nerve root. Radiculopathies. Pain from radiculopathies can also follow one or more dermatomes. So one example of this is pain in the sciatica nerve. Reflexes are automatic, rapid, and voluntary response to a stimuli. They involve sensory stimuli from a receptor that is conducted along the afferent or incoming sensory nerve, and this is followed by a synapse in the spinal cord or the cranial nerve, and the production of an outgoing or an efferent motor impulse conducted along a peripheral nerve to then elicit the response. So the example of this would be touching the hot pan and then quickly jerking your hand away. At the same time, interneurons, are able to transmit the sensory or the afferent information to the brain to initiate assessment and to make a determination as to whether or not further action would be required. And if the brain deemed that it was, then an efferent or a motor response would be sent here. Some reflexes control autonomic activity or posture, and these take place continuously without you being aware. In addition, everyone has an acquired or learned reflexes, such as those that you develop like when you learn to ride a bike. You also have basic reflexes like your patellar or your knee-jerk reflex, or oculocephalic or doll's head response are also useful in diagnosis. The positive doll's eye reflex, where the eyes move in the opposite direction of the head, indicates an intact brain stem. In a negative doll's eye reflex, the eyes remain midline or move in the same direction of the head when the head is turned, and that indicates severe dysfunction. So we would look at this in someone that is comatose. Other things that we would look at that might indicate neurological problems are absent, weak, or abnormal responses, depending on where they occur and where the potential damage is in the spinal cord. Neurons communicate with other neurons or glands through generation and conduction of nerve impulses. The nervous system is made up of two main types of cells, neurons and glial cells. The neurons are the main cells of the nervous system, composed of a cell body that contains the organelles. A group of neuron cell bodies are next to each other in the central nervous system, and the whole thing is called a nucleus. And the group of neuron cell bodies that are located outside of the central nervous system is called the ganglion. Neurons have nerve fibers that extend out to the neuron cell body, known as dendrites, that receive signals from other neurons, or axons that send signals along to other neurons. When these two neurons come together, it's called a synapse, and this is where one end of an axon releases neurotransmitters, relaying the signal to the dendrites or directly to the cell body of the next neuron in the series. To trigger the release of the neurotransmitters, an electrical signal races down the axon known as action potential. These nerve impulses represent changes in the electrical property of the neuron cell's membrane. All cells have electrical charges associated with their membrane. So these neurons conduct impulses throughout the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. They require glucose and oxygen, and there are several variations of them depending on their function. The dendrite is the receptor site. This conducts impulses towards the cell body and contains the nucleus. The axon conducts impulses away from the cell body towards the connecting neuron to release the neurotransmitter chemical. Just to recap, the dendrite is the receptor site which conducts impulses towards the cell body. This cell body contains the nucleus. The axon conducts impulses away from the cell body toward the connecting neuron, where it can release the neurotransmitters at its terminal point. The nerve fibers are covered by a myelin sheath that insulates the fiber and speeds up this rate of conduction. The myelin sheath is then formed by Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system and by oligodendrites in the central nervous system. Interruptions in the myelin sheath are called nodes of Ranvier. This helps these signals skip along or move along quickly. In the slide, we see that the neurons are supported and protected by large numbers of glial cells. Astroglia or astrocytes provide a link between the neurons and the capillaries for physical and metabolic support, and they contribute to the blood-brain barrier. Oligodendrocytes provide myelin for axons in the central nervous system. Microglia can help with phagocytic activity, and the epidermal cells line the ventricles of the neurotube cavity and form part of the choroid plexus. If a neuron is damaged, it will die. If the cell body is damaged, the neuron is going to die. In the peripheral nervous system, the axons are able to regenerate if the cell body is still viable. After damage to the axon happens, the area distant to the injury will degenerate because it doesn't have the nutrients, and it will be removed by the macrophages and the Schwann cells. The Schwann cells will then try to form a new tube at the end of the part of the axon that's left, and the cell body can become larger and synthesize additional proteins to replace the axon. Neurogenesis is the production of new neurons in certain areas of the brain, especially the hippocampa area. We now see that the hippocampal neurogenesis is critical in forming new memories, and this can be stimulated by lifestyle changes such as increases in exercise. Neurons communicate through action potentials. These are movements of ions between the outside and the inside of the axon. When the action potential occurs, a message is sent to neighboring neurons. And this is an all or nothing process. Neurons have electrical excitability, which allows them to respond to a stimuli by generating a nerve impulse. The stimulus increases permeability of the membrane of the neuron, allowing sodium to flow into the cell to depolarize it and create an action potential whenever the threshold is reached. This change to a positive electrical charge in the membrane results in increased permeability in the surrounding area, and that impulse is able to move along the membrane. Complex electrical circuits exist in the nervous system with multiple synapses on each neuron. The electrical activity of the brain is monitored by attaching electrodes to the scalp and measuring brain waves, known as an EEG. Recovery occurs if the potassium moves out of the cell and the normal permeability of the membrane is restored. Then the sodium-potassium pump would return sodium and potassium to their normal location. In the myelinated fibers, the action potential is generated only at the nodes of Ranvier, and so the impulse can skip along rapidly. The large axons conduct impulses more rapidly than small ones, and the synapse helps the connection between the neurons and the effector site. The speed of the action potential is influenced by the diameter of the axon and the amount of insulation or myelinization. The larger the diameter of the axon, the faster the action potential would be conducted. Neurons and their targets form synapses. The neuron that generates and conducts the action potential is called a presynaptic cell. The target cell is called the postsynaptic cell. And so the presynaptic cell is always a neuron because the neurons have axons and can form the synapse. The postsynaptic cell can be a neuron or a skeletal cardiac or a smooth muscle cell or a gland. Chemical synapses rely on the release of neurotransmitters, which are chemicals that carry signals from one neuron to the next, while electrical synapses rely on the electrical current. Chemical synapses are a little bit slower than electrical ones, and electrical synapses can be bidirectional. There are several neurotransmitters in the body. Here are a few examples. I would be aware of the first one for sure. Acetylcholine is present at the neuromuscular junctions in the autonomic nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and sometimes the central nervous system. Catecholamines include norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. These are present in the brain. Norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter in the sympathetic nervous system. Both norepinephrine and epinephrine, when released from the adrenal medulla on top of the kidneys in response to sympathetic nervous system stimulation, can circulate in the blood and the interstitial fluid and diffuse into the synaptic cleft, stimulating the appropriate receptors in the sympathetic nervous system. Serotonin is involved in mood, emotions, and sleep. Histamine is involved in emotions, regulation of body temperature, and water balance. GABA is the most common inhibitory neurotransmitter, often seen in anxiety, right? So more GABA is better to reduce the anxiety. Glycine is the most common inhibitory neurotransmitter in the spinal cord. The roles of neurotransmitters in mental illness and other pathologies are currently being studied. For example, norepinephrine and dopamine are excitatory, so low levels may be linked to depression. The enkephalins and beta endorphins are of interest because they can block conduction of pain in both the spinal cord and the brain. Many drugs are developed that mimic the effects of these neurotransmitters by stimulating certain receptors and promoting similar effects. Drugs can also affect neurotransmission, inhibiting the enzymes that would normally inactivate the transmitters or interfering with the uptake of the neurotransmitters for recycling. The autonomic nervous system includes the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, and these systems act in opposition of one another, providing a fine balance that helps with homeostasis. The autonomic nervous system provides motor and sensory innervation to the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The individual is usually unaware of this involuntary activity. The pathway in the motor fibers of the autonomic nervous system involves two neurons and a ganglion. That ganglion is a collection of neuronal bodies in the autonomic branches of the peripheral nervous system. Ganglia should be thought of as a synaptic relay station between the neurons. Preganglionic fibers are located in the brain or the spinal cord. The axon synapses with the second neuron in the ganglion outside of the central nervous system, and the postganglionic fiber continues to the effector organ or the tissue. The sympathetic nervous system increases the level of activity in the body, increasing cardiovascular, respiratory, and neurological function. It is necessary for the fight or flight or stress response and is augmented by increased secretions from the adrenal medulla on top of the kidneys in response to sympathetic nervous system stimuli. All preganglionic fibers of the autonomic nervous system release acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter, while postganglionic sympathetic nervous fibers release norepinephrine, except for those that supply the sweat glands. Motor nerves in the autonomic nervous system follow a unique two-neuron arrangement. The preganglionic neurons carry the signal out from the central nervous system, transmitting the impulses to clusters of nerve cell bodies called ganglia. The postganglionic neurons receive the signal from the ganglia and then deliver it out to the target tissue. Neurotransmitters are groups of chemical signaling molecules that help transmit impulses from one nerve fiber to the next. In the sympathetic nervous system, the neurotransmitters relay signals from preganglionic nerves to the ganglia and from postganglionic nerves to the target tissue. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system exit the brain and spinal cord and inner relay stations known as ganglion. The parasympathetic ganglion are located close to the organs that they stimulate. Sympathetic ganglia, on the other hand, are far away from the organs. So messages from the brain pass from the preganglionic neuron through the ganglion to the postganglionic neuron and finally out to that target organ. Preganglionic sympathetic fibers use acetylcholine, and most postganglionic sympathetic nervous system fibers release norepinephrine. The postganglionic fibers to sweat glands and blood vessels in skeletal muscle are cholinergic. The peripheral nervous system or craniosacral nervous system dominates digestive system and aids in the body's recovery after sympathetic activity. There are two locations of peripheral nervous system preganglionic fibers in cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 at the brainstem level and the sacral spinal nerves. The vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, provides innervation to the heart and digestive tract. In the peripheral nervous system, the ganglia are scattered and located close to the target organ, and the neurotransmitters at both the preganglionic and postganglionic synapse is acetylcholine. There are two types of cholinergic receptors, nicotinic and muscarinic. The nicotine receptors are always going to be stimulated by acetylcholine and are located in the postganglionic cholinergic neurons in both peripheral nervous and sympathetic nervous system. Muscarinic receptors are located in effector cells and are stimulated by or inhibited by acetylcholine depending on the organ. So this is just showing you a little bit of the differences between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. All right, acetylcholine here is the neurotransmitter released from the preganglionic synapses in both. All right, and then one is responsible for rest and digest, and the other one is responsible for activating the fight or flight. So in fight or flight, from postganglionic, we'll have the norepinephrine activating that alertness, that response. From the postganglionic in the autonomic, we'll have acetylcholine or nitric acid helping us, or nitric oxide, I'm sorry, trying to help us rest and digest. All right, so if you look at this, I would know this chart well. This just shows you the different changes, sympathetic versus parasympathetic. So here we see dilation of pupils, dilation of the bronchi, increase in the heart rate, okay? Over here we see constriction of pupils, increases in saliva production, reduction in the heart rate. Neurological damage from different causes has different similarities because of the area of the brain or the spinal cord that's affected. And that's what's going to actually define the function or what's going to be affected. So damage to a certain area from a tumor or a head injury can result in the same neurological signs and symptoms. Now, an infratentorial lesion is located below the brainstem or below the tentorium. If we have a small lesion in this area, it can affect the motor and sensory fibers, and we can see widespread impairment in respiratory, circulatory function, and level of consciousness just by a small lesion in the infratentorial area. Local effects related to specific areas of the brain or the spinal cord will depend on what area was affected by the lesion or the trauma. So examples include paresis or paralysis of the right arm. This would be from like damage to the section of the left frontal lobe, and loss of vision that results from damage to the occipital lobe. With expanding lesions such as growing tumors or hemorrhages, we may see additional impairment based on the amount of adjacent area that is affected or involved. With supratentorial lesions, these usually occur in the cerebral hemisphere above the tentorian cerebelli, and so these areas can cause dysfunction in discrete areas like numbness in a hand, but the lesion would usually have to be large before it would affect consciousness. Infratentorial lesions are located below the brainstem or below the tentorium, and again, a small lesion in this area can cause widespread impairment. In most people, damage to the left hemisphere would cause a loss of logical thinking, ability, analytical skills, or intellectual abilities and communication skills. Right side damage can impair the artistic abilities, so music, art, also behavioral problems, social relationships here, spatial orientation, self-care deficits. An individual can exert different levels of attention or consciousness based on things that are happening in the immediate environment. One early change noted in people with acute brain disorders is a decreasing level of consciousness or responsiveness. Extensive supratentorial lesions must occur in the cerebral hemisphere for there to be a loss of consciousness, but small lesions in the infratentorial area can affect the brain and the reticular activating system, which is going to affect your level of alertness or arousal, because that's what that controls. Various levels of reduced consciousness can present as lethargy, confusion, disorientation, memory loss, unresponsive to verbal stimuli, or difficulty arousal. So we use a tool such as the Glasgow Coma Scale, and we look at the certain things on that Glasgow Coma Scale as we're doing the assessment, which will tell us about the level of consciousness, how the person is affected. It looks at responses to verbal stimuli, to noise, and things like that. The terminal stage deep coma is marked by a loss of all reflexes, fixed, dilated, pupils be slow, irregular, pulse, and respiration. So that'd be the worst case scenario of a coma. All right, and then we can have also a serious level where someone doesn't respond to painful stimuli or verbal stimuli. All right, so there's some reflex present, but they're not responding to everything. So if you look at this, this is your coma scale, and we go on a scale of 3 to 15. Okay, usually 3 to 8, this says if the person's in a coma, but usually once it drops down to about 10, we're starting to see some deterioration in functioning. And what they're looking at, does the client open their eyes spontaneously when you walk in the room, or do you have to say something, or do you have to induce some sort of pain? Same thing, are they oriented when you talk to them? Or are they confused but able to answer questions? Or are the words inappropriate? Is the response inappropriate? Are they comprehending? How's their speech? Are you able to understand the speech? And then the motor response, are they able to follow commands? Do they remove their hand, like if you apply pressure to the nail bed, or if you induce some sort of pain, do they withdraw? And how's their posture? Because the decorticate, meaning with everything going towards the core, okay, or decerebrate with the extensor, either one of those two could indicate severe brain damage. You should know this, and you should also know what the criteria is for brain death, okay? Vegetative loss is going to be a loss of awareness and mental capacities from diffuse brain damage. The brain stem may still function and support respiratory, cardiovascular, or autonomic functions here. But the person is unresponsive to external stimuli. Some can recover, but some will have neurological impairment. And then locked-in syndrome is a condition where the person with the brain damage is aware and capable of thinking, but they can't communicate because they're paralyzed. Some people in this condition can actually move their eyes in a yes or no response. All right, you want to know this. This is the criteria for brain death, and this is often required to terminate medical interventions because individuals can be maintained on artificial cardiopulmonary support, meaning, we're giving them support for the heart and the lungs. All right, so criteria for brain death would include cessation of brain function, meaning a flat or inactive EEG, absence or brain of the brainstem reflex or response, absence of spontaneous respiration. So when we take them off the ventilator, they don't immediately start breathing. Establishment of irreversible brain damage by confirmation of the cause of the dysfunction. And then drug overdose or hypothermia can cause loss of brain activity, but a lot of times it would only be temporary. We would also want evaluation twice by different physicians. So, second evaluation by a different doctor. All right, damage to the upper motor neurons in the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex or to the cortical spinal tracts in the brain would interfere with voluntary movement. This can cause weakness or paralysis on the opposite or the contralateral side of the body. Affected areas like the arms or the legs would depend on the site of the damage. The muscle tone and the reflexes may be increased, known as hyperreflexia, because that intact spinal cord is still trying to conduct impulses, and there's no moderating or inhibiting influences sent from the brain because of the spastic paralysis. So this can lead to immobility, resulting in contractures in the affected limbs. Damage to the lower motor neurons in those anterior horns in that gray matter of the spinal cord can cause weakness or paralysis on the same side of the body or at or below the level of damage. Damage to the lower motor neuron in the anterior horn of the spinal cord can cause weakness or paralysis on the same side of the body at or below the level of damage. In the area of the damage, the muscles are usually flaccid with no tone. Reflexes are absent, known as flaccid paralysis, and the cord below the damage is intact, but some reflexes in that area may be present and hyperactive. With lower motor neurons, they're located in the nuclei of the cranial nerves in the brainstem, and so we can see ipsilateral weakness or flaccid paralysis from the damage to the cranial nerves containing the motor fibers. We also have two involuntary motor responses that can occur in someone with severe brain trauma, and that would be that posturing I talked about, decorticate, meaning towards the core, and decerebrate, which is more extension. Either can occur in a person with damage to the cerebral hemisphere. Decorticate responses include rigid flexion in the upper arms, adducted arms, and internal rotation of the hands. The lower limbs are extended towards the core. In decerebrate, responses occur in people with the brainstem lesion and CNS depression from those systemic effects. The upper and lower limbs are extended, as is the head, and the body is typically arched. So there's your pictures of both, the corticate being the ones with the hands towards the body. Sensory loss can involve things like touch, pain, temperature, and position, and special senses of vision, hearing, taste, and smell. The somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe receives and localizes sensory input from the body, and it's mapped out to receptors in the skin and the skeletal muscle in the different body regions. The dermatome map we talked about earlier helps with evaluation of the spinal cord lesions. Any damage to the cranial nerve or their nuclei or to the assigned area of the brain can interfere with vision or other special senses. Because of the unique anatomy of the visual pathway, loss of the visual field can depend on the site of damage in that visual pathway. At the optic chiasm, the fibers in each optic come together and divide. If the optic chiasm is totally destroyed, vision can be lost in both eyes. Partial loss can result in a variety of effects depending on the particular fiber that is damaged. The optic tract coursing from the optic chiasm to the occipital lobe on one side includes fibers from half of each eye. So if the optic tract or occipital lobe is damaged, vision would be lost from the medial half of one eye and the lateral half of the other. This is called homonymous hemianopia. The effect is loss of the visual field on the side opposite to that of the damage. So damage to the left occipital lobe would mean loss of the right visual field. Other types of visual loss may occur depending on the point of damage in the visual pathway. Partial loss of vision may lead to an inability to coordinate input from the right and left visual field, and this can lead to diplopia, double vision, loss of depth perception, and hand-eye coordination. Aphasia refers to an inability to comprehend or express language. There are many types of aphasia. Three main types are expressive, receptive, and global. Dysphagia refers to partial impairment and is more common, but the term aphasia is used to refer to both partial and total loss of the ability to communicate. Expressive or motor aphasia results in impaired ability to speak or write fluently or appropriately. The person is unable to find intelligible words to construct a meaningful sentence. This happens when Broca's area is damaged. Receptive or sensory aphasia is an inability to read or understand spoken word. This occurs from damage to Wernicke's area in the left temporal lobe, and the result is receptive aphasia. Global aphasia commonly describes a combination of both expressive and receptive aphasia resulting from major damage in the brain to both Broca and Wernicke areas. Aphasia may also be described as fluent or non-fluent. In fluent aphasia, the pace of speech is pretty normal, but the speech itself contains made-up words and sentences that do not make sense. Fluent aphasia is associated with damage to Wernicke's area. Non-fluent aphasia is slow, labored speech with short phases and words that are sometimes omitted. It's associated with damage to Broca's area. Dysarthria is a condition where words cannot be articulated clearly, and this is motor dysfunction that usually results from cranial nerve damage or muscle impairment. So there's your different types of aphasia. I would know those. Again, expressive aphasia is going to be the impaired ability to speak or write fluently. Okay, and it's going to occur usually when there's damage to the Broca area or in the cortex of that dominant frontal lobe, usually that left lobe. The receptive or sensory aphasia is inability to read or understand. It does not include hearing or visual impairment. The source of the problem is usually inability to process the information, and therefore the damage is usually in Wernicke's area in the left temporal lobe. Global aphasia describes a combination of both excessive and receptive aphasia, and that would be major damage to both Broca and Wernicke's. Dysarthria, the words cannot be articulated clearly. This is motor dysfunction from cranial nerve damage or impairment. Agraphia is impaired writing ability. Alexia is impaired reading ability. That's why we have to call her Alexis. Please change the channel because she can't read. Agnosia is loss of recognition or association. So visual agnosia indicates inability to recognize normal objects. So like you give your client with Alzheimer's a comb and they're holding it in their hand and they're staring at you like, what do you want me to do with this? And they have no clue. Seizures or convulsions caused by spontaneous excessive discharge of neurons in the brain, and this can be precipitated by inflammation, hypoxia, or some kind of bleed in the brain. The seizure is usually focal or related to the site of the irritation, but it can become generalized. A seizure is manifested by involuntary repetitive movement or abnormal sensation. The seizure may be precipitated by inflammation, hypoxia, or bleeding in the brain. The seizure is manifested by involuntary repetitive movements or abnormal sensations known as an aura, like lip smacking or clothes picking. The aura is the phenomena that precedes the seizure, where you have some sort of abnormal sensation, feeling, changes in vision, hearing, taste, or smell. And the disturbance can vary from one person to another. Symptoms of the seizure can be from mild to severe depending on the type of seizure, and they would include temporary confusion, a staring spell, uncontrollable jerking of the arms and legs, loss of consciousness or awareness, cognitive emotional symptoms like fear and anxiety. Seizures can be generalized. They can appear to involve all areas of the brain, and those are called generalized seizures. Absence seizures, also known as petit mal seizures, are typically going to cause a person to stare in space or make subtle body changes like eye blinking. Tonic-clonic seizures, also known as grand mal seizures, are the most dramatic. They can cause loss of consciousness, stiffness, shaking, loss of bladder control. Myoclonic seizures appear as sudden brief jerks or twitches of the arms and legs and usually no loss of consciousness. Partial seizures, also called focal seizures, involve only one part of the brain. So with a simple partial seizure, one part of the brain is affected, and usually what we'll see is twitching or strange sensations, but no loss of consciousness. Complex partial seizures are characterized by confusion, inability to answer questions or interact. The person may or may not remember some or all of the episode. And then status epilepticus is when we have a seizure that lasts longer than 5 minutes or multiple seizures very close together and the person doesn't recover consciousness between them. This is life-threatening. Skull has brain tissue, blood, and cerebrospinal fluid. The volume of the spinal fluid must remain constant, and we must have normal pressure at all times inside the cranial cavity. Temporary fluctuations in blood flow and blood pressure can occur with activities like coughing or bending over. The fluids in the blood and cerebrospinal fluid are not compressible. The brain is encased in a rigid skull that does not expand, so any increase in fluid volume like blood or inflammatory exudate or a mass such as a tumor causes increases in pressure in the brain. The result is that less arterial blood enters that area of the brain, and eventually the brain tissue itself is compressed. Both of these effects decrease the function of neurons and brain tissue will die. The pressure increases at the site of the problem and is gradually then dispersed throughout the central nervous system through continuous flow of the cerebrospinal fluid and blood, leading to widespread loss of function. Changes in the intracranial pressure can be monitored with instruments placed in the ventricles or indirectly through radiology and assessment of the level of consciousness and vital signs. Increased cranial pressure is common in neurological problems like a brain hemorrhage, trauma, cerebral edema, infection, tumors, or accumulation of excessive amounts of cerebrospinal fluid. This is just a picture showing you, the increased brain here and what it can do. So if we have too much pressure, it can cause herniation of the cerebellum, or it can cause something called an uncal herniation or downward displacement of the brain stem through that tentorial notch. Some other signs that we may not have talked about yet, we're going to talk about now, effects of that intracranial pressure. So decreasing level of consciousness, early morning headaches, okay, vomiting, vital signs are going to change. So what we'll see is an increase in the systolic pressure and an increase as a result of that in the pulse pressure. Slow heart rate, okay, and that's in response to the increases in the blood pressure. We'll see increased pressure of the cerebral spinal fluid causing swelling around the optic disc and papilla edema, and pupils can become fixed and dilated from pressure on cranial nerve 3 here. When the pressure increases, the body would initially try to compensate by shifting more cerebral spinal fluid towards the spinal cavity and increasing the venous return from the brain. The resulting hypoxia is going to trigger the arterioles to become vasodilated in the brain. And that is going to happen through autoregulation of the reflexes. And this is trying to improve blood supply to the brain. This adds to the volume inside the skull and is only effective for a short time because the compensatory mechanisms that are involved, ICP is usually elevated before the signs become apparent. And the first indication of increased cranial pressure is usually a decreasing level of consciousness or decreased responsiveness, known as lethargy. Other early indications include severe headache from stretching of the dura and the walls, vomiting. Often it's going to be projectile vomiting, not associated with the food intake. All right, and this is from pressure that's inside the brain on the emetic center in the medulla. So no food intake needed here. And then the papilla edema caused by increased pressure and swelling of that optic disc. The papilla edema can also be observed by looking through the pupil of the eye at the retina, where the optic disc provides a window into the brain. The optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, is a projection of brain tissue that is surrounded by the cerebral spinal fluid and the meninges, and then enters the eye at the optic disc, where it reflects the increased intracranial pressure in the brain. These early clinical manifestations continue to increase in severity as long as the ICP continues to rise. When someone develops intracranial pressure, it's going to affect the vital signs a little bit. If the intracranial pressure continues to build, a sequence of events is going to occur as the body tries to supply oxygen to the brain. So first, cerebral ischemia is going to develop, and that will stimulate what we call Cushing's reflex from the vasomotor center, trying to increase the arterial blood supply to the brain. Systemic vasoconstriction is going to happen here as the body attempts to increase the systemic blood pressure and force more blood into the brain to relieve the ischemia. Then those receptors in those carotid arteries are going to respond to that increase in the blood pressure by slowing down the heart rate. Okay, so that's some critical signs that we're going to see here. Okay, let's talk about that just in general. So we'll have an increase in the systemic blood pressure. That's going to cause a difference now between the systemic and the diastolic blood pressure, because there we have something called pulse pressure. And so usually that's between 30 and 40. But here the diastolic is going to stay the same, but our systolic is going to go up. That's going to increase that pulse pressure. And it usually happens as the person takes a breath in. Inspiration is when it happens. Okay. Also, the receptors in those carotid arteries now are going to feel that increase in that blood pressure, okay, through those receptors in the arteries, and that's going to cause bradycardia, or the heart rate, to slow down. Now, if you look up something, or you'll see a slide on here called Cushing's triad, that's really talking about those changes that you're going to see when someone has increased cranial pressure. All right, so now we have these chemoreceptors, and chemoreceptors are going to respond to the low carbon dioxide level that is accompanying the systemic circulation and reduce that respiratory rate. So our respirations are going to slow down here. As the cerebral circulation starts to improve from the ischemia, the vasoreflex or vasoconstriction is going to stop momentarily, and that will cause the ICP again to start to cause ischemia. So this cycle is going to be repeated. Once the body kicks in, okay, and improves the circulation to relieve the ischemia, then the vasoconstriction reflex is going to stop. And now increasing pressure again is going to cause that ischemia to reoccur. Again, this is going to happen over a short time, and that whole cycle is going to be repeated. The brain is going to respond to that ischemia through feedback control mechanism for the blood pressure, okay, trying to protect the rest of the body, and that causes a conflict of interest. Because as the increased cranial pressure continues to rise, so does the blood pressure. The increasing pulse pressure, which is again that difference between the systolic and the diastolic pressure, is going to be very important in someone with ICP. That widening gap in the blood pressure is the result of the slow heart rate and that rapid on and off cycle of that Cushing's reflex, which again is that vasoconstriction of the blood pressure to increase that vasoconstriction of the vessel to increase the blood pressure. As the blood pressure increases, the ischemia decreases, the reflex stops, the ischemia starts to reoccur from the increased pressure, the reflex kicks in again, starts the vasoconstriction back up again. So it's a vicious cycle there. All right, here's your Cushing's triads. So your respirations are going to slow down in response to the chemoreceptors that are recognizing the carbon dioxide levels in the blood. You have an increase in the blood pressure, an increase in that pulse pressure, which is the difference between the diastolic and the systolic bradycardia, a decrease in the heart rate. In addition to papilla edema and reflex changes, other significant indicators of increased cranial pressure can be seen in the eyes. We'll have pressure on oculomotor cranial nerve 3. This affects the size and the response of the pupil. So usually one pupil ipsilateral to the lesion can become fixed or unresponsive to the light and dilated as the peripheral nervous system fibers in the affected oculomotor nerve become non-functional. As the pressure continues, both pupils can become fixed and dilated, or what we know as blown. Other signs of increased cranial pressure can include ptosis or droopy eyelids. This is also caused by pressure on cranial nerve 3. And then innervation or stimulation to the muscle of the upper eyelid is also impaired, and this causes abnormal or excessive eye movements, such as nystagmus. The lumbar puncture is done to look at that cerebral spinal fluid. They might use a manometer to look at the cerebral spinal fluid to see if the pressure in it is elevated, right? Because we would be expected to be elevated in someone that has increased cranial pressure. The composition of the fluid can vary depending on what the cause is. So pinkish with erythrocytes if it's from some sort of trauma. Cloudy yellowish fluid would indicate some sort of infection, and abnormal protein, some sort of growth or neoplasm. If a mass, such as a blood clot or a tumor, gets large enough, it can displace the brain tissue, causing herniation. There's a few different types of herniation. In the transtentorial herniation, the cerebral hemispheres, the dicephalon, and the midbrain are pushed or displaced downward, and that would affect the flow of the blood, the cerebral spinal fluid, the reticular activating system, and the respirations. The uncal or uncinate herniation occurs when the uncus of the temporal lobe is displaced, and that would happen pushing down past the tentorium cerebelli, putting pressure on the third cranial nerve, the cerebral artery, and the reticular activating system. This is a picture just showing you about different brain herniations and how they can affect. So here it shows you the uncus, okay, across the tentorius, across the tentorial notch, and then what signs and symptoms we would expect to see, some of the treatments there. This is showing those three herniations that I talked about. So you have the tumor here, and it can either cause the downward displacement of the brain stem through that tentorial notch, the cerebellar herniation, or that uncal herniation of the temporal lobe. CT scans, MRIs, cerebral angiography are all used to diagnose this, along with the lumbar puncture, radiography, Doppler ultrasounds. We may use EEGs as well. So all these things we may look at to analyze both the structure, the fluids, the pressure, using the Glasgow Coma Scale to look at our level of consciousness. That lumbar puncture, remember, the best place is between that L3 and L4 to check pressure and analyze for that cerebral spinal fluid that flows through the subarachnoid space and is developed in that choroid plexus and also absorbed in that arachnoid villi. All right, now we're moving on to neurological problems. Tumors occupy space in the brain, and because of that, they cause increased cranial pressure. There's little amount of room in there with the ridge of skull and everything that is in there, and that can cause dysfunction related to where those tumors are located at. Benign tumors as well as malignant tumors can be life-threatening when they're in the brain unless they're in an area where they can be removed. And the reason being because they both have the capability of creating that increased pressure. Gliomas form the largest category of primary malignant tumors, and they come from glial cells in the central nervous system. These tumors are classified according to the cell that they arise from. Astrocytomas are the most common, and the location of the tumor itself. Tumors that develop in the meninges, meningioma, or pituitary gland cause similar neuro effects that result from pressure on the brain. Primary malignant tumors rarely come from outside the central nervous system, but multiple tumors may be present within the central nervous system. Secondary brain tumors are common, usually metastasizing from breast or lung tumors, and they can cause effects similar to those of a primary brain tumor. Diagnosis is typically made with MRI or stereotactic biopsies. Primary malignant brain tumors, especially astrocytomas, don't usually have well-defined margins, and they're invasive. They have irregular projections into the adjacent tissue, and they're difficult to totally remove. There's usually inflammation around the tumor adding to the pressure, and in some cases we'll see obstruction of the cerebral spinal fluid flow or the venous sinuses, which cause increases in the cranial pressure. As the mass expands, it will compress and distort the tissue around it, usually resulting in some sort of herniation. A small tumor in the brainstem or the cerebellum can compress the medulla in a short time, but tumors in the cerebral hemispheres, usually in silent areas without obvious function, can grow large before their effects are noticeable. This is an astrocytoma. These are tumors that develop in the central nervous system. They grow from these star-shaped astrocyte cells and they develop in your brain. They can be benign or malignant. They're glial cells, and this is the supportive tissue in your brain. Other glial cells can include oligodendrocytes and epidermal cells. Astrocytoma is the most common glioma. Brainstem and cerebellar tumors are common in young kids, and research into these types of tumors continues. We look at prenatal exposure to carcinogens and embryonic development, as there may be some clues there as to what is occurring with these children while they're in utero. Tumors can occur in adults, and they usually happen in midlife. Adults are affected more frequently by tumors in those cerebral hemispheres. The site of a tumor determines the focal signs. In some cases, focal or generalized seizures are the first sign as the tumor irritates surrounding tissue. If the tumor continues rapidly growing, then signs of increased cranial pressure can develop quickly, and this may start with early morning headaches. Headaches will increase in severity and frequency. Vomiting can occur, lethargy and irritability can occur, along with personality and behavioral changes. Brain stem or cerebellar tumors can affect the cranial nerves, causing unilateral face paralysis or visual problems. In some cases, the clients may develop focal or generalized seizures as the tumor irritates that tissue. Unlike other forms of cancer, brain tumors don't usually cause systemic signs of malignancy because they don't metastasize outside of that central nervous system, and they usually cause death before they are large enough to cause some sort of general effect. Treatment is really going to be limited to surgery, if possible, chemo, and radiation. All right, next, vascular disorders. These vascular disorders can be hemorrhagic or ischemic. Hemorrhagic usually means bleed. Ischemic is usually some sort of blockage. If the deficit comes from hemorrhage, additional effects of increased cranial pressure can cause local ischemia and generalized symptoms. Global cerebral ischemia can develop secondary to shock or cardiac arrest and occur when there is impaired perfusion of the entire brain, which would cause loss of function and generalized cerebral edema. In mild cases, confusion and neurological dysfunction can develop temporarily if we have severe or prolonged ischemia. Significant diffuse necrosis or infarction can happen, and if it does, this person would end up in a deep coma. A TIA is caused by a temporary localized reduction of blood flow to the brain, and these people usually recover within 24 hours. They can happen one time or in a series, and they're typically a pre-indicator of some sort of stroke. Again, these TIAs can be caused by a partial occlusion of an artery, by atherosclerosis, by small emboli, through vascular spasms, or loss of autoregulation. TIAs again serve as a warning and lead to early diagnosis and treatment of a problem before the person does have a stroke. The brain does need a constant supply of glucose and oxygen, or it will suffer permanent damage. Not all strokes are preceded by TIAs. TIAs are directly related to the effects would be directly related to the location of the ischemia. Manifestations of the TIA would be things like impaired function, muscle weakness in an arm or a leg, visual disturbances or numbness, paresthesia in the face can also occur. Transient aphasia or confusion can develop during this TIA. Usually it only lasts a few minutes or longer, rarely longer than 1 to 2 hours, and then the signs would disappear. Any repeated attacks, again, are warning of the development of obstruction related to the atherosclerosis itself. A stroke is an infarction of the brain tissue that occurs because we lack the blood supply there. Necrosis is usually an outcome of an occlusion of the cerebral blood vessel by an atheroma or an embolus that causes ischemia. And this could be the consequence of a ruptured cerebral vessel, which causes hemorrhage and then increased cranial pressure. 5 minutes or less of ischemia can cause irreversible nerve damage. A central area of necrosis would develop, surrounded by inflammation, and function to the area is immediately lost. The tissue would liquefy here, leaving a cavity in the brain. And this would be liquefaction necrosis that we talked about earlier. Repeated attacks are frequently a warning of the development of obstruction related to that atherosclerosis. These attacks should be investigated depending on the cause to prevent permanent brain damage. So not a very good picture here. You might get a better look at this in your book, but this is just showing an infarction there, an acute hemorrhagic infarction in the brain. Strokes are considered a major cause of disability. Again, this is an infarction of brain tissue resulting from a lack of blood flow. The necrosis can be an outcome that causes ischemia, or it could be the consequence of some ruptured cerebral vessel that causes hemorrhage and increased cranial pressure. Atheromas can develop in the large arteries, and this is usually from some piece of plaque breaking off. So this can develop like in the carotid and cause narrowing of the lumen by plaque and thrombus, leading to possible TIAs and infarction. Any sudden obstruction caused by an embolus lodging in a cerebral artery is the second type of stroke, known as cerebral embolus. And emboli can result from also other materials like a tumor, air, or infection, such as endocarditis. Intracerebral hemorrhages are usually caused by rupture of the cerebral artery in a client with severe hypertension, and that is the third class of stroke. Hemorrhagic strokes usually occur more frequently and more severe and destructive. So they're going to affect a larger part of the brain. And because of the increased risk for increased cranial pressure here with the hemorrhage, the effects are evident in both hemispheres, and they're usually complicated by the effects of the bleeding as well as the stroke itself. In addition to the disruption in the blood supply, we now have blood available in those interstitial areas that can affect the membranes. It can cause secondary damage like vasospasms, electrolyte imbalances, acidosis, and cellular edema. So two main types of strokes, hemorrhagic and ischemic. Ischemic, of course, is the obstruction. Usually plaque or something blocks, an embolus or something blocks that flow of blood. And then the hemorrhagic is usually caused by a rupture of the vessel. And so we have a bleed. MRIs can possibly differentiate the cause of the stroke or possible causes of the dysfunction. Cerebral edema and increasing area of infarction in the first 48 to 72 hours can increase the neurological deficits that may occur. The inflammation and the pressure in the brain has to be minimized as soon as possible, and therapy started to dissolve the thrombi so that we can maintain adequate perfusion. Any risk factors for stroke we have to be concerned with all the time before this even occurs. So those risk factors would include diabetes, hypertension, systemic lupus erythematosus, elevated cholesterol levels, hyperlipidemia, atherosclerosis, history of TIA, increasing age, sleep obstructive apnea, and cardiac disease. Also, the combination of oral contraceptives and cigarette smoking have been documented as causes. Emboli can arise from the atheromas in the large arteries like the carotids, or from the cardiac disorder of the left ventricle, and this might happen in an acute MI, AFib, or endocarditis, or from an implant like a prosthetic valve. Severe or long-term hypertension and arteriosclerosis in the elderly also can increase the risk for intracerebral hemorrhages. Warning signs of a stroke include that sudden transient weakness, numbness, tingling in the face, arm, or leg, temporary loss of speech, failure to comprehend or confusion, sudden loss of vision, sudden headache, unusual dizziness or steadiness. We'll also look at the person, see if they can smile, see if one side of the face droops. So we're looking at that face. We might ask them to stick their tongue out to make sure it goes straight out and it doesn't droop to one side or go to one side. We may ask them to raise both arms and make sure that not one of the arms is drifting downward. We'll look at the speech, ask the person to repeat a simple phrase and see if the speech is slurred or strange. And time, you want to call 911 right away if you see any of these things occur, because time is of the essence here. So there is a stroke scale that helps assist with rapid diagnosis of a stroke, and this is in an emergency situation. And again, we look at the capacity for speech, level of consciousness, motor abilities, assessment of eye movements, similar to what I just talked about on that FAST scale, where we look at the face, the arms, the speech, the time. Other signs and symptoms depend on the obstruction, the size of the artery involved, and what area of function is involved. Sometimes they can have a small infarction and we may not be able to easily see those symptoms. Initially, flaccid paralysis can be present. Spastic paralysis can develop weeks later if functional deficits increase during 48 hours. The first 48 hours, like inflammation at the site, neurons around the infarcted area will have to recover. All right, so this can happen if, there's some obstruction of the arteries and we have infarctions occurring there. So you would want to call 911, get the client to a hospital right away. We would want to know the time between the onset of the stroke and treatment, because if it is a ischemic stroke, we can give something called TPA to try to break the clot down. Again, that's all going to be based on the time. Surgery, steroids, supportive treatment, PT, OT. An aneurysm is caused by a weakness in the wall of an artery. It's a dilation of that artery, thinning out the wall. These aneurysms in the brain can be multiple, and they frequently are, and they usually occur at the points of the bifurcation on the circle of Willis. So this is that circle of Willis. Remember that alternate blood supply in the brain there, and bifurcation is where these arteries merge together to form that anastomosis. And these berry aneurysms can form there. It's like a little pouch where that weakness is in the wall of the artery and where that branching occurs. Any force of blood at that area would cause a bulging in the wall. This is often caused by hypertension. So initially the aneurysms will be small and asymptomatic, and the doctor may even be aware of them, but insurance companies don't typically allow any sort of intervention until they get to a certain size. They will enlarge over the years, and then when they start to compress the structure like a cranial nerve, when they start to cause clinical signs or a rupture occurs, then intervention will take place. The rupture often comes from sudden increases in the blood pressure during exertion, and then that can lead to bleeding into the subarachnoid space, the location of the circle of Willis, and the cerebrospinal fluid. The blood is going to be irritating to the meninges, causing an inflammatory response and irritation of the nerve that passes through that meninges. That free blood also can cause vasospasms in those cerebral arteries, reduce the perfusion, and cause additional ischemia because of that. And then hemorrhages from the ruptured vessel can lead to increased cranial pressure and death. The enlarging aneurysm can cause pressure on the surrounding structure, such as the optic chiasm and the cranial nerves, and this can cause loss of vision in the visual fields. The mass can also lead to headaches as the tension increases on the blood vessel and the meninges, headache and photophobia or sensitivity of the eyes to light, intermittent periods of dysfunction leading to things like confusion, slurred speech, or nuchorigidity or stiff neck. If a rupture occurs or if there's a subarachnoid hemorrhage, then we might have a blinding headache, vomiting, photophobia, seizure, loss of consciousness. Death can occur shortly after a rupture. If the aneurysm is diagnosed before the rupture and can be treated surgically, we can do that by either clipping it or tying it off. In the interim, while the patient's waiting for surgery, any sudden increase in blood pressure would have to be avoided. The brain aneurysm itself, referred to as a cerebral aneurysm or intracranial aneurysm, again, is that weak bulging spot on the wall of the artery, like a thin balloon or a weak spot. So that's that Barry aneurysm, okay? Here's a picture of it, and you can see that bubble there, which is your actual aneurysm. Initially, those aneurysms are going to be small and asymptomatic. Once they start to cause a problem or rupture, then we're going to see those clinical signs. All right, so those are going to be the loss of the visual field, the headache, the photophobia, the dysfunction, the nuchorigidity, vomiting, seizures, etc. And there's your treatment again. We would want to reduce that increased cranial pressure and those vasospasms. If it doesn't rupture, we can clip it or tie it off. All right, infections. So first we're going to look at meningitis. This is an infection caused by a virus, bacteria, or sometimes a fungus in the meninges of the central nervous system. All age groups are susceptible, but there is increased evidence that it happens a lot to people that live in close proximity. So that's going to be like your college students or your high school students. You know, someone comes in, they're sick, they have this, and they start coughing and sneezing, and those respiratory droplets are going to get everybody sick. Okay, so it usually binds to those nasopharyngeal cells and then goes through the mucosa barrier attached to the choroid plexus and enters the cerebral spinal fluid. In young children and adults, the Neisseria meningitis or meningococcus is frequently carried in that nose of asymptomatic carriers and spread by those respiratory droplets. And this is going to happen more often in the late winter or the early spring. Epidemics are common in schools or institutions where we have close contact between the kids. All right, so anybody that is a close contact of someone affected should get prophylactic treatment here. Common bacterial infections lead to purulent exudate in meningitis that covers the surface of the brain, causing the surface to appear flat. The exudate is present in the cerebral spinal fluid, and the blood vessels on the surface of the brain are going to look dilated. It can be secondary to other infections like sinusitis or otitis, or from an abscess where the infection spread through the bone to the meninges like an abscessed tooth. Any sort of head trauma or surgery can also result in meningitis. Aseptic or viral meningitis usually comes from an infection like the mumps or the measles. So the organisms in meningitis reach the brain through the blood or from nearby tissue or direct access through a wound. The membranes are continuous around the central nervous system, and the cerebral spinal fluid flows into that subarachnoid space, and the infection spreads rapidly through the coverings of the brain. Focal signs are absent because there's no localized mass of infection. The inflammatory response to the infection leads to increased cranial pressure, and the pia and arachnoid layers will become edematous. The exudate is going to be present in that cerebral spinal fluid, and the blood vessels on the surface of the brain, again, are going to be dilated here. So here's your pictures of your meningitis. You could also have a particular rash with certain types of meningitis. And then a couple other things, as you'll see in the slide. This is just a slide showing the neutrophils present with the bacterial meningitis. In babies or neonates, E. coli is the most common, typically associated with neurotube defect, premature rupture of the amniotic membranes, or difficult delivery. In young children, meningitis is often formed from bacterial infections caused by Haemophilus influenza, and it happens more often in the autumn or the winter. In the older person, Streptococcus pneumonia is a major cause. Sudden onset of meningitis is common, followed by severe headache, back pain, light sensitivity or photophobia, that hyperextended stiff neck known as nuchal rigidity. And these all come from that meningeal irritation. That nerve is running from the meninges down the back through the spinal cord. Okay, and that is like a tightrope as it pulls. Every time it pulls, or every time there's tension on that, like in the two clinical signs that I'm about to talk about, you're going to have irritation in the meninges, and that's really what's creating the pain there. So the other two clinical signs would include the Kernig sign, which is resistance to extending the leg or the knee. So Kernig for knee or leg extension when they're lying with the hip flexed, and then the Brzezinski sign is the neck flexion, and that causes flexion of the hip and the knee, and pain occurs with that. We'll also see vomiting, irritability, lethargy, and this can progress to stupor or seizures. These are common indicators of increased cranial pressure. Fever and chills with leukocytosis can indicate infection, and then meningococcal infections usually have a rose-colored petechial rash or extensive ecchymosis over the body. Other signs include feeding problems, irritability, lethargy, high-pitched cry, bulging fontanelles in the newborn. Complications in the newborn for this include hydrocephalus if the cerebral spinal fluid is blocked by pus or adhesions, or if we have cranial nerve damage. In some cases, damage to the cerebral cortex can occur, resulting in mental retardation or seizures or motor impairment. And if we have a fulminant case, which is a rapidly progressive severe case caused by some virulent organism, then meningococcal disseminated intravascular coagulation can occur. So this is DIC, which is really a problem with the blood clotting. And so what's going to happen is a person's going to start bleeding from like their mouth, any wounds, their anus, their vaginal area, because the clotting factors aren't working correctly here. All right, this is also associated with hemorrhage of the adrenal glands and meningococcal septicemia. This can directly cause an adrenal hemorrhage and vascular collapse or shock and death. So these signs come from the meningeal irritation. The other two clinical signs of meningeal irritation include resistance resistance to the leg extension will line with the hip flex. That is going to be the Koenig. Remember, knee extension is painful. Knee extension for Koenig sign, and then Brudzinski, the neck flexion leads to the knee flexion. So in Brudzinski, you got the N first before the K, and so that's your little mnemonic to try to remember those. We also will look at that cerebral spinal fluid from the lumbar puncture between that L3 and L4. If meningitis is present, the cerebral spinal fluid pressure will be elevated. The fluid's going to look cloudy. It's going to have an increased number of white blood cells, and the causative organism in the cerebral spinal fluid or blood would also have to be identified. Treatment, antimicrobials, measures to monitor the ICP, steroids to help reduce any inflammation, and possibly vaccines for the meningitis. An abscess is a localized infection that occurs in the frontal or temporal lobes, and usually there is necrosis of the brain tissue and a surrounding area of edema. Knowing the person's medical history could be important here. Abscesses usually come from spread of organisms from the ear, throat, lung, or sinus. So in those types of infections, this might occur afterwards. It also can be from septic emboli from acute bacterial endocarditis or from some injury or surgery. Focal signs indicate neurological deficits as the increasing cranial pressure develops. Common organisms are going to be Staphylococci, Streptococci, and Pneumococci. The onset of the brain abscess can be slow. Focal signs indicate neurological deficits and increasing cranial pressure development. Encephalitis is infection of the parenchymal or connective tissue in the brain and the cord, particularly in the basal ganglia. The infection can include the meninges. Necrosis and inflammation will develop in the brain tissue, resulting in permanent damage. The early signs of infection would include severe headaches, stiff neck, lethargy, vomiting, seizures, and fevers. Encephalitis is usually viral, but can be related to other organisms. There may be some kind of delay before we see the signs. Western equine encephalitis is an arboviral infection spread by mosquitoes, occurs more frequently in the summer months, and it's common in young children. The St. Louis encephalitis is found in the U.S. It affects the older adult more seriously than young ones. And then we have the West Nile that's currently going on in New Jersey. 2 people have recently died from that. And so this is caused by a flavivirus spread by mosquitoes. And certain birds act as a host here. The focus for control is to track the spread and reduce the mosquito bites. So, you got to be careful if you're hanging out in New Jersey now and there's a lot of mosquitoes around biting. You want to protect yourself. This infection causes flu-like symptoms with a low-grade fever and headache, followed by confusion and tremors. Encephalitis. This is neuroborreliosis or Lyme disease caused by a spirochete, those little spiral bacteria that we looked at, Borrelia burgdorferi. And this is transmitted by ticks in the summertime. The site of the tick bite is usually going to be red center, and it increases in size, and it will form something that looks just like a bull's eye with the red in the center and then a circle around it. The bacteria goes through the circulation system. It's going to cause sore throat, dry cough, fever, headache. Eventually, these clients can develop cardiac arrhythmias and neurological abnormalities like facial nerve paralysis related to meningoencephalitis. Also, pain and joint swelling can develop in the large joints. This can progress to chronic arthritis, and it can persist for months. Prolonged therapy with antimicrobials like doxycycline is prescribed. So doxycycline is a tetracycline. Remember, tetracyclines will knock you up. Can't take them with milk in your cup. Usually not for kids under 8, mostly for grown-ups. Herpes simplex encephalitis occasionally occurs, and that is dangerous. This can come from the spread of herpes simplex 1, from the trigeminal nerve ganglion. It causes necrosis and hemorrhage in the brain and the frontal and temporal lobes. Amoebic meningoencephalitis can also be caused by the amoeba Naegleria fowleri, and it lives in warm water, typically found in the summer months in the southern United States. So what you see here is a lot of people down there, they like to swim in lakes and ponds. This is where the water is not really moving that well, and these amoeba like to grow in there, and so they get in there and swim or bathe, and they get this infection. It is a rare infection that results in inflammation and swelling of the brain or the spinal cord, and if we don't treat it early, it can definitely be fatal. Other infections would include microorganisms that target the central or peripheral nervous system. So rabies. This is caused by a virus transmitted by the bite of a rabid animal. You want to be careful with these nocturnal animals like raccoons that come out in the daylight, because when they come out in the daylight, likely they're going to be rabid, especially if they come where people are. The virus would travel along the peripheral nerve to the central nervous system, causing severe inflammation and necrosis, especially in the brainstem and the basal ganglia. These clients are going to have a headache and fever and sensitivity to touch, and they may develop seizures. The virus can travel to the salivary glands with difficulty swallowing, caused by muscle spasms and foaming at the mouth. Respiratory failure eventually is going to cause death in these clients. Tetanus or lockjaw is caused by the Clostridium tetani. This is a spore-forming bacillus. Remember, bacillus is rods. The spores can survive for years in soil. Vegetative form is anaerobe. Okay, so that means that it can survive without oxygen, and it's going to live deep in tissues like a puncture wound. So like when you step on a nail or a dog bite. The exotoxin would enter the nervous system. That's going to lead to tonic muscle spasm. Symptoms of infection include jaw stiffness, known as lockjaw, difficulty swallowing, stiff neck, headache, skeletal muscle spasms, and eventually respiratory failure. Poliomyelitis or infantile paralysis is rare in North America, but can still happen in some parts of the world. The immunization program is trying to combat this epidemic in both West and Central Africa. Large numbers of kids have been infected and are faced with the threat of paralysis. The polio virus itself is highly contagious through direct contact or oral droplet transmission. So a disease that was once almost totally eradicated is now coming back around. And several countries have this polio virus as well on hand for biological warfare, including the United States, Russia, and China. This poliovirus reproduces in the lymph tissue, in the oropharynx, and the digestive tract, and then enters the blood and eventually the central nervous system. It then attacks the motor neurons of the spinal cord and the medulla, causing flu-like symptoms in most cases, but paralysis and respiratory failure in other cases, depending on the level of destruction. Symptoms again include fever, headache, vomiting, followed by a typical stiff neck and flaccid paralysis. Microorganisms such as Candida albicans or Toxoplasma gondii can cause infection in the brain in immunosuppressed individuals. These are considered opportunistic infections. Herpes zoster or shingles causes varicella zoster virus in the adult, seen years after the primary infection of chickenpox, and the chickenpox usually occurs in the childhood. Then this lays dormant and comes back out as an adult when you're immunosuppressed or really stressed. The shingles usually affect one nerve line, one cranial nerve, or one dermatome, a cutaneous area innervated by a spinal nerve pain, paresthesia, and a vesicular rash that develop in a line unilaterally. This can occur on the face following the trigeminal nerve or along the path of the lumbar nerve from the spine extending around one side of the hip. Lesions persist for several weeks, then clear up in the majority of cases. Older adults develop postherpetic pain, neuralgia, or pain that continues after the lesions disappear. In clients with immune deficiencies, lesions may spread locally. Visual impairment has resulted if it involves the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. Vaccines are available. Post-polio syndrome occurs 10 to 40 years after someone recovers from the original infection, and this can cause progressive and debilitating fatigue, weakness, pain, and muscle atrophy. The more severe the original infection was, the more severe the effects of the post-polio syndrome. Causes of Reye syndrome have not yet fully been detected, but it is linked to viral infections such as influenza in young children that are treated with aspirin. So typically we don't treat kids under 5 with aspirin, especially if they have a viral infection. The virus will appear 3 to 5 days after the onset of the viral infection. Pathological changes can occur in the brain and the liver. Non-inflammatory cerebral edema develops caused by increased cranial pressure. The brain function is severely impaired by the cerebral edema and the high amounts of ammonia that are in the brain related to liver dysfunction. So these levels of ammonia will cause confusion and make a cloudy brain, something like what we see in people that have cirrhosis of the liver and what we call Wernicke's encephalopathy. The liver can enlarge and it will develop fatty changes and go into acute failure. Jaundice is not present, but the levels of the liver enzyme will be elevated. Metabolic abnormalities would include hypoglycemia, increased lactic acid in the body and the body fluids, contributing to the acute encephalopathy. And in some cases, the kidneys can be affected with fatty degenerative changes, causing increases in the BUN and the creatinine. Manifestations vary. Encephalopathy would be the initial one, leading to lethargy, headache, and vomiting, which are then followed by disorientation, hyperreflexia, hyperventilation, seizures, stupor, or coma. There is no immediate cure for this. Guillain-Barré syndrome, aka post-infectious polyneuritis. This is an anti-inflammatory condition of the peripheral nervous system. The cause is unknown. There is evidence that shows an abnormal immune response, possibly an autoimmune response that is following a viral infection or some immunization that the client received. Local inflammation will be accompanied by accumulated lymphocytes, demyelination, and axon destruction. These changes cause impaired nerve conduction, especially in those efferent or motor fibers, and the afferent sensory and autonomic fibers may be involved as well. If the cell body remains alive through the acute period, the axon is able to regenerate. Initially, the inflammatory and degenerative response would affect the peripheral nerves in the legs. Then inflammation ascends to involve the spinal nerves to the trunk and the neck, and frequently includes the cranial nerves. So what is this actually saying? It's going to start in the legs, the lower legs usually, and it's going to work its way all the way up, till it affects the chest and eventually the central nervous system. The critical period for the Guillain-Barré syndrome is when that ascending paralysis starts to involve the diaphragm and the respiratory muscles, because your client's not going to be able to breathe there. They're going to have difficulty. Recovery is usually spontaneous, with manifestations diminishing in the reverse order. The motor function is regained first in the upper body and then gradually in the lower extremity. So we have progressive muscle weakness and areflexia starting in the legs, and this causes an ascending flaccid paralysis accompanied by paresthesia or pain and general muscle aching. As the paralysis advances upward from the legs, towards the chest and the brain. Vision and speech are impaired. The process can occur rapidly over a few hours or several days. If swallowing and respiration are affected, then it can cause a life-threatening situation. The autonomic nervous system impairment can occur, and that would be manifested as cardiac arrhythmias, fluctuating blood pressure, loss of the ability to sweat. Brain injuries often involve skull fractures, hemorrhage, and edema, or direct injury to the brain tissue itself. The injury can be mild, or it can cause bruising of the tissue, where it causes bruising of the tissue, or it could be severe and life-threatening, where it causes destruction of the brain tissue and massive swelling of the brain. The skull helps protect the brain, but could destroy it if bone fragments penetrate or compress the brain tissue, and we are not able to relieve the pressure, or the brain is not able to expand. Types of head injuries include a concussion, which involves mild traumatic injury. It is usually reversible with brain function, usually caused by some mild blow to the head that causes sudden excessive movement of the brain, disrupting the neurological function and leading to loss of consciousness. Amnesia or memory loss and headaches can follow a concussion. Recovery with no permanent damage usually happens within 24 hours. Recurrent concussions, like those suffered by boxers, football players, can cause progressive permanent brain damage. A contusion is the bruising of brain tissue with rupture of small blood vessels and edema, and it's usually caused by some blunt blow to the head. The possibility of residual damage would depend on the force of the blow and the degree of tissue that was injured. A closed head injury can occur when the skull is not fractured but brain tissue is injured and blood vessels are ruptured by the force exerted against the skull. Extensive damage can occur if the head is rotated with considerable force. Open head injuries are those that involve fractures or penetration of the brain by missiles or sharp objects. Depressed skull fractures involve displacement of a piece of bone below the level of the skull, compressing the brain tissue. With this type of fracture, blood supply to the area is often impaired and considerable pressure is going to be exerted on the brain. Basilar fractures occur at the base of the skull and are often accompanied by leaking of cerebrospinal fluid through the nose or the ear. This fracture can occur when the forehead hits a car windshield with considerable force. Cranial nerve damage and dark discoloration around the eyes are common. A battle sign or battle sign is a bruise that indicates fracture at the bottom of the skull. A battle sign is like raccoon's eyes, so the person will have bruising around both eyes. That's usually related to some sort of skull fracture. You might also notice clear fluid from the client's ears and nose. Sometimes we'll put a piece of gauze up under that nose and you'll get like a little halo out of that, and that halo is indicative usually of a skull fracture. Also, on that gauze, you can test for things like glucose. All right, so this is caused by a tear in the protective covering of the brain from the trauma, that leaking of the cerebrospinal fluid. The Contrecoup injury occurs, we see this a lot in shaken baby syndrome, or when someone hits the front of a car and then bounces back. So this is actually the brain bouncing back and forth off the skull. First, the brain may hit the front of the head and then bounce back to the back of the head. It's usually caused in acceleration or deceleration injuries. So the skull and the brain hit a solid object and the brain is rebounding back and forth. You can also see this sometimes in shaken baby syndrome. So this is showing you that Contrecoup injury where the skull hits the front and then it rebounds and hits the back. Primary brain injuries are direct injuries like lacerations or crushing of the neurons, glial cells, and blood vessels of the brain. They can involve a laceration, compression of tissue by a piece of bone or foreign object, or rupture of a vessel. The application of unusual force may rotate or shift inside the skull. Brain tissue may be damaged by the rough, irregular inner surface of the skull or by movement of the lobes of the brain against each other. So this is called a shearing injury, where they're rubbing back and forth against each other. Secondary brain damage is caused by development of additional injurious factors. Secondary injuries can result from additional effects of cerebral edema, hemorrhage, hematoma, cerebral vasospasms, infection, and ischemia related to systemic factors. Again, this is just showing you the potential effects of a head injury. I would look at them very closely and see how each one of these head injuries is going to affect someone. Trauma to the brain tissue can cause loss of function in the part of the body controlled by that specific area of the brain. Cell damage and bleeding can lead to inflammation and vasospasms around the site, increased cranial pressure, and ischemia and dysfunction. The central area of damage undergoes necrosis and would be replaced by scar tissue or a cyst. A hematoma itself is collection of blood in the tissue, and it usually is caused by ruptured blood vessels right after an injury or after some delay. It also can develop after surgery. Hematomas and hemorrhages are classified by their location in relation to the meninges. Hematomas can be reabsorbed and cause changes in the vital signs. Hematomas and hemorrhages are classified again, if you look at this one, by their location in relation to the meninges. So you have a dura hematoma on the top. It's showing extradural or epidural hematoma, where the blood fills the space between the dura and the bone. And then you have the subdural hematoma, where the blood fills the space between the dura and the arachnoid, and then the intracerebral hematoma. Epidural hematoma results from bleeding between the dura and the skull. It's usually caused by some tear in the middle meningeal artery of the temporal region. This person can lose consciousness. Signs usually occur within a few hours of the injury. The subdural hematoma develops between the dura and the arachnoid when there's a small tear in a vein, causing a slow bleed. We'll see this a lot of times in the elderly. A hematoma can be acute with symptoms presenting in 24 hours, or subacute, where we have increasing pressure that develops over a week or so. A chronic subdural hematoma may occur in the older adult with brain atrophy, as this allows more space for development. A tear in the arachnoid can allow cerebral spinal fluid to leak into the subdural space, and this creates additional pressure. In all types of hematomas, the bleeding leads to local pressure on the adjacent tissue and general increases in the intracranial pressure. A hematoma disintegrates about 7 days after the injury. When the blood accumulates slowly, then the blood will often go through hemolysis, and this causes cell breakdown, exerting osmotic pressure, drawing more water and fluid into the area, increasing the size and the pressure of the mass, raising the intracranial pressure. The subarachnoid hemorrhage occurs in the space between the arachnoid and the pia, and it's associated with traumatic bleeding from the blood vessels at the base of the brain. Because the blood mixes with circulating cerebral spinal fluid, a localized hematoma cannot form. Intracerebral hematomas result from contusions or shearing injuries and may occur several days after the injury. In this picture, you see a chronic subdural hematoma, and it's trying to show compression of the underlying brain and the lateral ventricle. All types of hematomas lead to local pressure on adjacent tissue. Generalized increases in pressure and causes are sports injuries, automobiles, motorcycle accidents. Falls can be common in any age group. Again, in all types of hematomas, we're going to see local pressure on the adjacent tissue and a general increase in the cranial pressure. The person with a head injury will manifest the characteristic focal signs and generalized signs of increased cranial pressure. Seizures are often focal but can be generalized, and they occur because of the irritating blood. Cranial nerve impairment can occur, especially in someone that has a sustained basilar fracture. Otorrhea and rhinorrhea, leaking of spinal fluid from the ear or the nose, can occur with fractures and tearing of the meninges. It allows fluid to pass out of the subarachnoid space. Openings can provide microbes with an entry point into the brain. Fever here may be a sign of hypothalamic impairment or of cranial or systemic infection. Stress ulcers can develop from increased gastric secretions. So treatment, CT scan, MRI, steroids, antibiotics, possible surgery, and oxygen. Injury to the spinal cord can occur because of a fracture or dislocation of the vertebrae, compressing, stretching, or tearing the spinal cord. The supporting ligaments and the intervertebral disc can be damaged. Most injuries happen in the area of the spine that provide more mobility but less support. So C1 to C7 and T12 to L2. These result from fracture, dislocation of the vertebrae. Cervical spine injuries can be caused by hyperextension or hyperflexion of the neck. Dislocation, again, from crushing or compression of the spinal cord, and the compression causes the injury to the spinal cord when great force is applied to the top of the skull or to the feet. So here's a couple types of spinal cord injuries. Dislocation of any vertebrae can crush or compress the spinal cord and compromise the blood supply. Cervical spine injuries can result from hyperextension or hyperflexion of the neck. Compression fractures cause injury to the spinal cord when great force is applied to the top of the skull or to the feet. So like if you dove into an empty pool, or if you jumped off of a high area and landed on your feet. Vertebral fractures can be classified as simple, meaning a single line break, compression where we have crushed or shattered bone in multiple fragments, a wedge where we have a displaced angular section of the bone, a dislocation where vertebrae is forced out of its normal position. Spinal cord injuries are often unstable, requiring immediately to be immobilized, and this is essential to prevent other changes here. Damage to the spinal cord can be temporary or permanent. Nerves in the spinal cord do not undergo mitosis, but their axons can regrow. Laceration of the nerve tissue by bone fragments would usually result in permanent loss of conduction in the affected nerve tract. Complete transection or severing or crushing of the cord causes irreversible loss of all sensory and motor function at or below the level of injury. Partial transection or crushing injuries may allow recovery of some functions. Bruising is irreversible damage that involves mild edema and minor bleeding that temporarily impair conduction of the nerve impulse. Compression of the cord would have to be relieved quickly to maintain an adequate blood supply. Prolonged ischemia and necrosis would cause permanent damage. Bleeding and inflammation can create additional pressure and further interfere with the blood flow. Edema and hemorrhage can extend several segments above or below that level of injury. Damaged tissue also releases mediators, norepinephrine, serotonin, and histamine. These lead to vasoconstriction, causing additional local ischemia and possible necrosis. Destructive enzymes would be released as well, causing more inflammation and necrosis. Initially, loss of function may appear to be extensive because of the additional compression, but as edema subsides, partial recovery of function may begin to occur. Regular assessment of movement and sensory response using the dermatome map can help determine the degree of damage or recovery in the spinal cord. When the injury occurs in the cervical region, inflammation may extend upward to the level of C3 to C5, interfering with phrenic nerve innervation to the diaphragm and affecting respiration. Ventilatory assistance may be required here. In the initial period after an injury, conduction of impulses stops in the nerve tracts and in the gray matter, known as spinal shock. The extent of the injury, the amount of resultant bleeding, and the need for surgical intervention would determine the rate and degree of recovery. Inflammation usually slowly subsides. Phagocytes will remove the damaged tissue and scar tissue will start to form. At this time, reflex activity resumes in the spinal cord below the level of injury, and any undamaged tracts continue to conduct impulses through the level of damage. Control of the reflexes below the level of damage is lost. So this picture is showing you, again, these areas of the spinal cord and what would be affected if damage were to occur in specific areas. Again, here, you see below the injury of the lumbar, we have no function at the level of the injury, okay? Below it, we may have some function. No function. Above it, we may have normal body function. So below it, we're going to lose sensation or voluntary movement and reflexes. Above it, we should have normal function. There are two stages in the post-traumatic period of spinal shock. The early stage of spinal shock and increasing impairment, followed by recovery and recognition of the extent of functional loss. During that initial period of spinal shock, all neurological activity would stop below and slightly above the level of injury. There are no reflexes present, including skeletal muscle, sensory and autonomic systems, bladder, and bowel function. Conditions may persist for days or weeks. During the period of spinal shock, signs include flaccid paralysis and sensory loss at or below the injured area, absence of all reflex responses, and loss of central control of autonomic function. In a client with a cervical injury, this includes loss of control of vasomotor tone, blood pressure, diaphoresis, and body temperature, as well as bladder and bowel emptying. Blood pressure is low and labile, meaning it's all over the place. Urinary retention and paralytic ileus are present here. Recovery from spinal shock is indicated by the gradual return of the reflex activity below the level of injury. No impulse, including reflexes, can pass through the specific area of the damaged neurons. In most cases, hyperreflexia will develop because the normal inhibitory or dampening impulse is not able to reach the cord level below the injury. Following recovery from spinal shock and return of the reflexes, spastic paralysis, sensory defects, reflex or neurogenic bladder and bowel function, urinary incontinence, reflex defecation are usually present below the level of damage. Gradually, the extent of permanent damage is revealed. Voluntary motor activity and sensory impulses are blocked at the level of damage. Effects of permanent damage depend on the level at which the spinal cord trauma occurred. For example, cervical injuries would affect motor sensory function in the arm, trunk, and legs, respiratory function. Sympathetic nervous system function T1 to L2, and sacral parasympathetic fibers. In clients with cervical injuries, respiratory function may continue to be a problem of concern due to phrenic nerve impairment and loss of intercostal muscle stimulation. blood pressure and body temperature may become liable, meaning they're all over the place, because the central control of the vasomotor tone and diaphoresis is not there. Paralysis of all four extremities is known as tetraplegia or quadriplegia. Paraplegia refers to paralysis of the lower part of the trunk and legs. Trauma in the lumbar region would interfere with function of the lower extremities and the sacral parasympathetic nerves. Partial cord injuries can cause different patterns of impairment. For example, ipsilateral paralysis or contralateral loss of pain and temperature sensation depending on the crossover point or the point of decussation and the location of the specific injured tracts. Remember that decussation is the crossing of those nerve fibers in the central nervous system. When we have injury of the cervical spine, stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system may result in autonomic dysreflexia. This serious complication is caused by sensory stimulus that triggers a massive sympathetic reflex response that is not able to be controlled from the brain. This trigger can cause noxious stimuli in the body and is most frequently caused by a distended bladder or a decubitus ulcer. A sensory stimulus to the central nervous system below the level of injury can stimulate the entire chain of the sympathetic nervous system and ganglia, leading to excessive vasoconstriction with sudden increases in blood pressure, severe headache, and visual impairments. Bradycardia would accompany this syndrome as the baroreceptors sense the high blood pressure and respond through the vagus nerve by slowing down the heart rate. Here's a picture of the autonomic dysreflexia and really what is actually occurring there. All right, complications are common after spinal cord injuries because of immobility and loss of function. So some of those complications are contractures from the muscle spasms, decubes from the person not being able to, reposition themselves, and often they'll have accidents like urinary accidents, fecal accidents, and that lays on the skin. And then we can also develop respiratory urinary tract infections and depression. Sexual function and reproductive capacity are also likely to be affected. The sensory and psychological components of the sexual response are usually blocked by the injury. Men can have neurogenic reflex erections. Penetration would depend on sustaining this reflex, which can be difficult. A lot of men are going to have high-level cord injuries, and when they do have those high-level injuries, they're infertile because the sperm production in the testes is going to be impaired here. Women usually resume menstrual cycles once they recover from the acute trauma and can bear children. Close monitoring of pregnancy is necessary, and vaginal delivery could be difficult for these clients. Treatment and rehab at the beginning of the injury, immobilization of the spine, maintaining the breathing and preventing shock, possible traction, relieve the pressure and repair tissues through the steroid use, reduce edema and stabilize the vascular system, and then ongoing care for complications. So that's your treatment. All right, next is congenital and neurological. This is going to include hydrocephalus. This is a condition where we have excess cerebral spinal fluid in the skull, compressing the brain tissue and the blood vessels. It's sometimes called water on the brain. In the majority of cases, we have a production of cerebral spinal fluid that is normal, but there is a reduction in the amount that is being reabsorbed, and those two have to be equal. The two types of hydrocephalus are non-communicating or obstructive hydrocephalus. It occurs in babies when the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid through the ventricles is blocked, usually at the aqueduct of Sylvius or the foramen magnum. in the communicating hydrocephalus. Absorption of the cerebral spinal fluid through the subarachnoid villi is impaired, and this causes increased pressure in the cerebral spinal fluid in the system. Developmental abnormalities are the most common cause of hydrocephalus, especially stenosis or atresia, which is the absence of a canal or an opening, and this is happening in the connecting channels between the ventricles or because of a thick arachnoid membrane. Obstruction can also develop at any age from tumor, infection, or scar tissue. Meningitis can cause obstructive hydrocephalus during the acute infection. And fibrosis can develop in the meninges, which would impair the absorption. In neonates, the skull can expand to some degree in early stages of hydrocephalus to relieve the pressure, but if conditions continue or if it's not treated quickly, brain tissue will be permanently damaged. In an older child or adult, the increased cranial pressure happens more rapidly because the fused sutures of the skull prevent expansion to accommodate the increased volume of the cerebral spinal fluid. In an infant, because the sutures of the skull have not yet closed, the head would enlarge beyond a normal size as fluid increases. Excess cerebral spinal fluid accumulates because more is produced than absorbed. This usually results from fetal developmental abnormalities such as stenosis or neurotube defects, and in many infants an associated myelomeningocele or Arnold-Chiari malformation is present. The obstruction causes an increase in back pressure of the fluid in the ventricles of the brain, dilating or enlarging the ventricles and compressing the blood vessels and the brain tissue. In communicating hydrocephalus, the absorption of cerebrospinal fluid through subarachnoid villi is impaired, causing increased pressure of cerebrospinal fluid in the system. In neonates, the skull expands to some degree and relieves the pressure. Again, if not treated quickly, the brain tissue is permanently damaged. This is just a picture showing the hydrocephalus here. Now, here's a baby who has increased cranial pressure, okay? So the signs of increasing cranial fluid depend on the age of the patient. In the neonate or the young infant, remember the head's going to enlarge. So you see this enlargement, the fontanelles would be bulging, and this client has what we call sunset eyes, where you can only see part of the pupil there. Spina bifida is a group of neural tube defects that are congenital anomalies, and they vary in severity. They are a common developmental defect with myelomeningocele occurring in many ways. The problem in spina bifida is failure of the posterior spinous processes to fuse. Okay, so these vertebrae are not fusing, and this allows the meninges and the spinal cord to herniate, causing neurological impairment. The three types of spina bifida are spina bifida occulta, which develops when the spinous processes do not fuse; meningocele, which is the same bony defect, but herniation of the meninges occurs through the defect, and the meninges and cerebral spinal fluid form a sac on the surface. The myelomeningocele is the most serious form of spina bifida. Here we have herniation of the spinal cord and nerves, along with the meninges and cerebral spinal fluid, resulting in considerable neurological impairment. In spina bifida occulta, only the spinous processes do not fuse. There's no herniation here of the spinal cord or the meninges. So this defect might not be visible, but usually we will see a dimple or a tuft of hair at the skin over the area of the site. This can be diagnosed through an X-ray or when we notice mild neurological signs because of tension on the cord as the child is growing. The meningocele is the same defect, but so we don't have the fusion of the spinous vertebrae, and also now we have herniation of the meninges through the defect, and the meninges and the cerebral spinal fluid form this sac on the surface, and you can actually see through the sac, and there's also going to be an absence of nerve tissue here in the sac. Right here, neurological impairment is not present, but there may be infection or rupture of the sac, so we have to keep this baby safe. Usually we put them on their bellies. And then myelomeningocele is the most serious form of spina bifida. In this, we have herniation of the spinal cord and the nerves, along with the meninges, the cerebral spinal fluid, and this is a considerable neurological impairment here. And there's the pictures of the three. First one is spina bifida occulta with that tuft of hair. The meningocele, which has just the herniation of the meninges and the cerebral spinal fluid. And then the myelomeningocele, which is the most serious, which includes the damaged nerves. Okay, so it's going to basically damage everything there. Spina bifida appears to have multifactorial causes. We see a combination of genetics and environmental factors contributing to the development. There is a high family incident associated with defects like anencephaly, the absence of the cerebral hemisphere and superior cranial vault, so they have no top to their head basically. Environmental factors include exposure to radiation, gestational diabetes, and defects of vitamin A or folic acid. So folic acid is the main one that we push, and we would recommend supplements before conception and for the first 6 weeks of pregnancy as a preventative measure. This is really education we should be supplying to anybody who's at risk for becoming pregnant, and really not so much in the way of supplements. We have other if they're not pregnant yet, a lot of other ways they can get it through foods. Alpha-fetoprotein that has leaked from the defect in the amniotic fluid surrounds the fetus. This level would be elevated during week 16 to 18, and we could detect this during a blood draw. The amniocentesis can also be analyzed, and we can detect the presence of elevated alpha-fetoprotein in the presence of spina bifida. Could also be diagnosed prenatally through ultrasounds. Signs and symptoms of the spina bifida are going to include the meningocele, the myelomeningocele visible over the spine, neurological deficits, sensory and motor function will be impaired below the level of the herniation. Treatment would be surgical repair and ongoing occupational and physical therapy after that repair. Cerebral palsy, this is a group of disorders with some degree of motor impairment, usually caused by genetic mutations, abnormal fetal formation of functional brain areas, infection, or brain damage during the perinatal period. Damage usually occurs in other areas of the brain, and so we'll have a clinical presentation that is variable depending on the area of the brain that was affected and how severe the trauma is. Damage can occur before, during, or shortly after birth. It's typically non-progressive. The brain tissue is altered by malformation, mechanical trauma, hypoxia, hemorrhage, hypoglycemia, hyperbilirubinemia, infection, or some other factor. In some cases, you'll see this with moms that have been using cocaine. In some cases, generalized necrosis, atrophy of the brain tissue have occurred, and in other cases, only 1 or 2 local areas are affected in the brain. Some single or multiple factors that may be implicated in development of CP, hypoxia, or ischemia is the major cause of brain damage, and this can occur prenatally, perinatally, or postnatally. Hypoxia caused by placental complications, difficult deliveries, vascular occlusions, hemorrhage, aspirations, respiratory impairment. High bilirubin levels from prematurity or Rh blood incompatibility, kernicterus, which is accumulated bilirubin that crosses the blood-brain barrier can damage the neurons there, and other causes would include infection, metabolic abnormalities, hypoglycemia in mom or baby. In some cases, the effects would be evident at birth, and in others, we'll see a delay in motor development. The muscle tone would be abnormal and doesn't become apparent for several months. We might also have some early reflexes like the Moro reflex, which can indicate cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is also classified on the basis of the area affected. So we talk about quadriplegia or diplegia, or the motor disability that is a result. So if you look down in the chart below, it just talks about the different types of cerebral palsy and what areas are damaged and how it affects that area. The first and largest group is those with spastic paralysis from damage to the pyramidal tracts or the motor cortex, or from the general cortical damage, and this form is characterized by hyperreflexia, meaning an excessive reflex response. For example, crossed legs are apparent when the child is held up, or a child with some mobility walks with a typical scissors gait, or the toes and with crossed legs. The second group is dyskinetic disease from damage to the extrapyramidal tract, like the basal nuclei or the cranial nerves, and this form of CP is manifested by slow, involuntary writhing. It's called athetoid or coriform, where we have rapid, jerky, involuntary movements and loss of coordination with fine movements. And then the third group is ataxic CP. This develops from damage to the cerebellum, and usually we'll see with this a loss of balance and coordination. Spastic paralysis usually is from damage to the pyramidal tracts, diplegia, or the motor cortex hemiparesis. Spasticity is manifested in increased muscle tone or resistance to passive movement with excessive reflexes. Hyperreflexia, unilateral use of the hands or feet, asymmetric body movements are indications of the abnormality. In dyskinetic disease, the area of damage is the basal nuclei. Remember that we talked about is responsible for movement, cranial nerves or extrapyramidal tracts. We have writhing movements or facial grimaces that may indicate athetoid CP. Manifested by athetoid or coriform involuntary movements, feeding difficulty, and constant tongue thrusting are signs of motor dysfunction and can interfere with nutrition and growth. And then the ataxic cerebral palsy, where we have loss of balance and coordination due to damage to the cerebellum. In addition to motor deficits, cerebral palsy can be accompanied by other problems depending on what area of the brain is affected. A common few areas of dysfunction are intellectual dysfunction, communication and speech, problems with seizures, and visual problems we'll have here. With regard to cognitive function, about 1/3 of people with CP have normal intelligence. About 1/3 would be mildly impaired and 1/3 severely and cognitively disabled. Communication and speech development are difficult because of the motor disability, possible impaired mentation, and visual or hearing defects. Some children born or several children born with CP will have learning disabilities and behavioral problems like attention deficit disorder, spatial disorientation, hyperactivity. Seizures, primarily of the generalized tonic-clonic type, are common, and visual problems like astigmatism or strabismus frequently occur. So some treatment here, stimulation, language, physical therapy, exercise, supportive, occupational therapy. Seizure disorders. Seizures result from uncontrolled excessive discharge of neurons in the brain. This can be localized or generalized and have many possible causes. Generalized seizures have multiple foci or origins in both the cerebral hemisphere and the brainstem and cause loss of consciousness, whereas partial seizures have a single or local origin, focal origin, often in the cerebral cortex, and they may not involve altered levels of consciousness. Partial seizures can progress to generalized seizures. Seizure disorders are characterized by recurrent seizures, sometimes called convulsions. Seizure disorders are classified by their location in the brain and their clinical features, including characteristic EEG patterns during and between seizures. Seizures may be primarily idiopathic, meaning they don't know why we developed it, or acquired secondary to some identified cause, like post-traumatic stress syndrome. They can also be categorized on grounds because they result from abnormalities in the brain, such as hypoglycemic, withdrawal from certain drugs, or temporary problems like febrile seizures in infants. A seizure can result from sudden, spontaneous, uncontrolled depolarization of neurons, causing abnormal motor or sensory activity and possible loss of consciousness. The neurons are hyper-excitable and have a low threshold for stimulation. Any physiological change like alkalosis or other sensory stimulus like flashing lights can activate these irritable neurons, and each seizure would last for a few seconds or minutes. The excessive activity of the neurons would then stop spontaneously. The altered pattern of the electrical behavior or the brain waves during the seizure can be demonstrated on the EEG, indicating the type of seizure and its focus. Observation by description of the seizure by bystanders is usually useful in identifying where the seizure originated from. Complications can arise from generalized tonic-clonic seizures or grand mal seizures that are severe and frequent. Injuries of varying type and severity may occur during a seizure. Recurrent or continuous seizures without recovery of consciousness are termed status epilepticus, and this could lead to serious complications if not treated promptly. Respiration can be impaired during a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, and skeletal muscle activity is intense. Combination of these events in status epilepticus lead to severe hypoxia, hypoglycemia, acidosis, decreases in blood pressure, all potentially resulting in brain damage. Many seizure disorders are idiopathic. They don't know why we have them. Family incidence is more evident in young children, so if someone else in the family has it, they're more likely to get it. Children with congenital disorders like cerebral palsy can have seizures from the brain damage. Acquired seizures that occur after a head injury or infection are more common now because improved treatment of these primary conditions has led to a higher survival rate. A seizure can be initiated by a tumor, infection, or hemorrhage in the brain, or by high fever in an infant or young child. Some systemic disorders like renal failure or hypoglycemia can precipitate a seizure in someone that has no history. Sudden withdrawal from sedatives or alcohol can also precipitate seizures, as well as drugs like cocaine. Precipitating factors or triggers include physical stimuli like loud noise, bright lights, biochemical stimuli such as stress, excessive premenstrual fluid retention, hypoglycemia, changes in medication, or hyperventilation. Prodromal signs occur in some people such as nausea, irritability, depression, or muscle twitching hours before the seizure occurs. An aura like a peculiar visual or auditory sensation or smell occurs immediately before loss of consciousness in many people. Loss of consciousness occurs and the individual falls to the floor. Strong muscle contractions resulting in flexion followed by extension of the limbs and rigidity in the trunk are known as the ictal phase. A cry escapes as the abdominal and thoracic muscles contract, forcing air out of the lungs. The jaws are tightly clenched and respiration ceases. In the clonic stage, the muscles alternately contract and relax, causing a series of forceful jerky movements along the entire body. The person may have increased salivation, foaming at the mouth, and may have bladder or bowel incontinence. Contractions subside gradually over the course of several minutes. The body becomes limp and consciousness slowly returns. The person is often confused and fatigued with aching muscles and falls into a deep sleep in the post-ictal phase. Partial or focal seizures come from epileptogenic focus and are related to single areas of damage in the cortex. They are manifested by repeated motor activity like jerking or turning the head or eye, jerky movement of a leg, or sensation such as tingling that begins in one area and spreads. Auditory or visual experiences like ringing in the ears or sensation of light can occur if the focus is in the related area. Memory and consciousness remain, although awareness is reduced. An EEG can determine the type and location of seizure. MRI can determine structural abnormalities in the brain. So emergency response for seizures would be anticonvulsant drugs. If the seizure can't be stopped, of course, typically we're going to put them in a space where they can't get injured. We're going to move harmful objects away. We don't put anything in their mouth. Once it ends, we would offer reassurances, and if the seizure continues immediately or immediately repeats, medical assistance, a lot of times we're going to apply oxygen here too because we do have electrical activity going through the brain and the heart. All right, next we're going to talk about chronic degenerative disorders. Multiple sclerosis involves progressive demyelination of the neurons in the brain, the spinal cord, and the cranial nerves. And there's a number of types of variations with the effects, severity, and progression. It's characterized by remission and exacerbations, but marked mostly by progressive degeneration. Loss of the myelin interferes with the conduction of the impulses in the affected fiber. It can affect all types of nerve fibers, motor, sensory, autonomic, and it can happen in patches throughout the nervous system. So here you'll see white matter changes around the ventricles in someone with the multiple sclerosis. The earliest lesion occurs as an inflammatory response, and these cells that normally do not enter the brain or the spinal cord and do so and attack the neurons with the loss of myelin in the white matter of the brain or the spinal cord. Research shows that a protein in the blood clotting mechanism may be a trigger for the immune response here. We have large areas of inflammation and demyelination. These are called plaques, and they become visible later beside the lateral ventricles in the brain cells, in the brain stem, and the optic nerves. The plaques will vary in size and may coalesce into a single patch. The initial inflammation may subside and neural function can return to normal for a short time or until another exacerbation occurs. Multiple sclerosis will reoccur. Initial inflammation can subside, but neural function can go back to normal for a short period of time. Neurodegeneration becomes irreversible. The function is eventually lost permanently. Each recurrence will cause more areas in the central nervous system to become effective, and multiple sclerosis can vary in severity. The onset of symptoms usually occurs in people between the age of 20 and 40, peaking around 30. The cause is unknown, but they do believe it's an autoimmune disorder. Multiple sclerosis has genetic, immunologic, and environmental components. There's an increased risk in someone that has a relative with it, and it could be nutritional deficits, changes in blood flow to the neuron. Manifestations are determined by the areas that are demyelinated, so blurred vision is a common early sign. If cranial nerves are affected, then we'll have double vision, scotoma, which is spots in the visual field, or dysarthria, poor articulation. Weakness can occur in the legs from the plaques on the corticospinal tract. Paresthesias can occur if sensory nerve fibers are damaged, and as the number of plaques increase with exacerbation, we end up with progressive weakness and paralysis going to the upper limbs, loss of coordination, and bowel and bladder and sexual dysfunction. Chronic fatigue is normal for these, or common. Sensory deficits would include paresthesia, loss of position sense in the upper body, face, and legs, and the mode of progression would vary. As the disease progresses, depression or euphoria, complications related to immobility, respiratory infections, decubiti, contractions are all common. So here's your multiple sclerosis, and it's just showing you the different areas of the distribution of the lesions and how those areas are going to affect you based on what is injured. It is a degenerative disease that attacks the central nervous system. The white blood cells attack the neurons. It's going to affect that myelin sheath and break it down or destroy it, okay, cause scarring there and blocking the ability of it to conduct impulses. There's no definitive test for multiple sclerosis. A long delay can precede the diagnosis. Exacerbation and remissions, involvement of the focal areas, progression, absence of other neurological diagnostic criteria would become the diagnosis for the MS. The MRI is also used for diagnosis and to monitor and detect the lesions in the central nervous system. The cerebrospinal fluid can be used as patients often have elevated protein, gamma globulin, and lymphocyte levels. The visual evoked potential test measures the activity of the brain in response to stimulation of specific sensory pathways and can detect slowing of conduction because of the demyelination. And then we also have optical coherence tomography, and this is an imaging tool that can show if the retinal structures or the optic nerve or the retinal nerves have been damaged. Parkinson's is a progressive degenerative disorder affecting the motor function through the loss of extrapyramidal activity. Dysfunction of the pyramidal motor system occurs because of progressive degenerative changes in the basal nuclei, especially in the substantia nigra. A decreased number of neurons in the substantia nigra will secrete dopamine and inhibit neurotransmitters, leading to imbalances between the excitation and inhibition neurons in the basal nuclei. This excess stimulation can affect movement and posture, increasing muscle tone and activity, causing resting tremors, muscle rigidity, difficulty in initiating body movements, and postural instability. A client with Parkinson's will tend to have a reduced number of cortical neurons, characteristic of dementia. The diagnosis would depend on the physical manifestations and clinical history. Primary or idiopathic Parkinson's disease usually develops after the age of 60 in both men and women. Genetically, several genes have been identified, but a common focus of research is possible damaging effects of viruses or toxins on cells. Toxins that might be linked to Parkinson's include manganese, carbon monoxide, carbon disulfide, and some pesticides. Parkinsonism may follow encephalitis, trauma, or vascular disease, or drug-induced Parkinson's disease is linked particularly to the use of phenothiazines, chlorpromazine. The effects may be reversible when the drug is stopped or discontinued. Early signs of Parkinson's include fatigue, muscle weakness and aching, decreased flexibility, less spontaneous changes in facial expressions, tremors in the hands at rest, and repetitive pill rolling motions of the hands. As the disease advances, tremors affect the hands, the feet, the face, the tongue, and the lips. The characteristic standing posture is stopped, leaning forward with the head and neck flexed. Motor impairment, increased muscle rigidity, difficulty initiating movement, slow movement or bradykinesia, and lack of associated involuntary movement can occur. Loss of arm swinging when walking or spontaneous postural adjustments when sitting. Festination or a propulsive gait, short shuffling steps with increasing acceleration occurs as postural reflexes are limited, leading to falls. Complex activities like getting up out of a chair become slow and difficult. So here's your different signs and symptoms what you would see with Parkinson's. Other functions affected would include the voice. It becomes low and devoid of inflection, so they speak in a quiet monotone. Dysarthria develops. Chewing and swallowing become difficulty, prolonging eating time and causing recurrent drooling. The face will have a mask-like look. Blinking of the eyelids is reduced, and they may look like they're staring blankly ahead. Autonomic dysfunction is manifested by urinary retention, constipation, and orthostatic hypotension. As the orthostatic hypotension develops, the threat of the falls increase. Common urinary tract and respiratory infections will occur. Dementia develops late in the course for some. So we can remove the cause if we know it. Dopamine replacement therapy, levodopa dopamine precursor, monoamine oxidase B inhibitors, anticholinergic drugs. We may use speech, language, and physical therapy, occupational therapy for the balance and the coordination, and then we're monitoring the treatment of those respiratory and urinary tract infections. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease and motor neuron disease. Amyotrophic means muscle wasting, and sclerosis refers to the degenerative hardening of the lateral cortical spinal tracts. The cause is not identified, but a number of genes on various chromosomes are linked. ALS primarily affects people between the age of 40 and 60. This is a progressive degenerative disease affecting the upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex and the lower motor neurons in the brain stem and spinal cord. Sensory neurons, cognitive function, and cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6 to the eye muscles are not affected. There is no cure for this fatal disease. This is a progressive degenerative disease, ALS, affecting both upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex and lower motor neurons in the brainstem and spinal cord. No inflammation is seen around the nerves. Studies show that supportive glial cells, called astrocytes, secrete neurotoxins, causing the death of the motor neurons. The loss of the upper motor neurons causes spastic paralysis and hyperreflexia. Damage to those lower motor neurons causes flaccid paralysis, decreased muscle tone, and reflexes. We have progressive muscle weakness, which will eventually affect respiratory function, resulting in death. A specific diagnostic test has not been able to confirm the presence of the disease. Many tests are required to eliminate other possible diagnoses. The upper extremities, particularly hands, manifest weakness and muscle atrophy with loss of fine motor coordination. Stumbling and falls are common. Muscle cramps or twitching may result from imbalances of antagonistic muscles. The weakness and paralysis will progress throughout the body. Dysarthria develops as the cranial nerves controlling speech are lost, so they're not able to articulate words well. Eventually, swallowing and respiration are impaired as a ventilator, and a ventilator would be required here. No specific treatment to slow the degeneration. They might undergo stem cell therapy. That they're currently looking at that. Pharmaceutical treatments to slow further damage to the neurons, moderate exercise, respiratory therapy, appropriate nutrition, speech pathology, occupational physical therapy. Myasthenia gravis. This is an autoimmune disorder that impairs the receptors for acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. The cause is unknown. Many patients have thymus disorders such as hyperplasia or benign tumors. The onset usually happens between age 20 and 30 for women and over 50 for men. Immunoglobulin G autoantibodies to the acetylcholine receptors form, blocking and destroying the receptor site and preventing further stimulation of the muscle, leading to skeletal muscle weakness and rapid fatigue of the affected muscle. The face and ocular muscles are usually affected initially, followed by the arm and trunk muscles. Dysphagia and aspiration are significant problems. Several tests are available, including electromyography to test for muscle fatigue, an assay of antibodies. One test uses edrophonium chloride or tensilon. This is a short-acting anticholinesterase inhibitor to prolong the action of the acetylcholine at the myoneural junction, resulting in a short period of increased skeletal muscle function. Muscle weakness and fatigue develops quickly when the muscles are being used. They'll have diplopia and ptosis that will impair their vision. The speech will become a nasal monotone. They'll have spontaneous loss of spontaneous facial expressions, and the face will start to look droopy and sad. The attempt to smile may look like a snarl. Chewing and swallowing can become difficult as weakness progresses and risk of aspiration increases. The head will droop as the neck muscles become involved. For treatment, anticholinesterase agents can temporarily improve the neuromuscular transmission. Steroids to suppress the immune system, immunosuppressants, plasmapheresis, and removal of antibodies from the blood, thymectomy. Huntington's disease or Huntington's chorea is inherited by autosomal dominant trait that does not manifest until midlife. Progressive atrophy of the brain occurs with degeneration of neurons, especially in that basoganglia and the frontal cortex. Ventricles are dilated. There's depletion of GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, in the basonuclei and the substantia nigra. Levels of acetylcholine in the brain also appear to be reduced. The following observations are noted. Mood swings, personality changes, restlessness and coriform, rapid jerky movements in the arm and face. Possible early indications of intellectual impairment like difficulty learning new information, loss of problem-solving skills, poor judgment, inability to concentrate, and memory lapses. With progressive degeneration, the following will occur. Rigidity and akinesia, making any movement difficult, personality changes, moodiness, behavioral disturbances that become more marked as dementia occurs or progresses. Until recently, there were no diagnostic tests available to identify affected individuals before the onset. This combination of factors increased the incidence of the disorder. That trend is changing because testing and genetic counseling are now available. The presence of the defective gene can be detected by DNA analysis. There are many formal definitions of dementia based on the following characteristics. It's a progressive chronic disease, cortical function is decreased, impairing cognitive skills such as language and numeracy, logical thinking and judgment, ability to learn information, as well as motor coordination. Loss of memory affects primarily short-term or recent memory, but can include confusion about events in long-term memory. Memory loss is often progressive, leading to long-term as well as short-term memory loss. Behavioral and personality changes are present. These changes lead to inability to work and perform activities of daily living. There are many causes of dementia, including vascular disease like arteriosclerosis, infections, toxins, and genetic disorders. Alzheimer's disease accounts for more than 50% of those affected with dementia, with vascular causes of dementia being second in place. There's a progressive loss of intellectual function that interferes with work relationships and personal hygiene. Personality lack of initiative, receptive behavior, and impairments in judgment, abstract thinking, Problem-solving abilities are characteristic of the disease. Typical changes include progressive cortical atrophy leading to dilated ventricles and widening of the sulci. Neurofibrillary tangles in the neurons and the senile plaques are found in large numbers. In the affected parts of the brain, the plaques that disrupt neuroconduction contain fragments from beta amyloid precursor protein. The role of this protein is a focus of research. A deficit in the neurotransmitter acetylcholine also occurs in the affected brain. No definitive diagnostic tests are available. Diagnosis is based on making observation and ruling out other possible causes. The specific cause is unknown. At least 4 defective genes located on different chromosomes have been associated with Alzheimer's disease. 3 gene mutations on chromosomes 1, 14, and 21 are inherited as autosomal dominant traits, resulting in early onset Alzheimer's dementia. One form of late-onset Alzheimer's has been linked to a mutation on chromosome 19. Other forms appear to be multifactorial in nature. Pathological changes in Alzheimer's disease include amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. Comparison of normal Alzheimer dementia brains is shown down here on the top, and the bottom brain shows a patient with Alzheimer's. The Alzheimer's brain shows gyral atrophy and sulcal widening greater than those seen in a person with no cognitive development issues. Onset trends to be slow or insidious. The course can extend over 10 to 20 years. In the early stages, we'll see gradual losses of memory and lack of concentration. Ability to learn new information and reason is impaired. Behavioral changes can also occur, such as irritability, hostility, and mood swings. Cognitive function, memory, and language skills will continue to decline. Problem solving, mathematical ability, and judgment are poor. Apathy, indifference, and confusion become more marked. The activities of daily living become difficult, affecting simple things like meal preparation, dressing, and personal hygiene. Wandering is common, and a person may become confused and lost even in a familiar area. In the late stage, the person does not recognize the family members, lacks awareness or interest in the environment, and is incontinent and unable to function in any way. Degenerative changes can gradually interfere with motor function. Comparison of normal and Alzheimer brains. The top is the normal brain, the bottom is the brain with Alzheimer's. So again, this is just showing the differences in those two brains. There's no specific treatment. They may use anticholinesterase drugs to slow the progression. We may see some temporary improvement there. Occupational therapy and a team approach for the caregivers and the client. Vascular dementia is caused by cerebrovascular disease and is frequently a result of multiple small brain infarctions. It's commonly in persons over the age of 70, especially those with high blood pressure. We can see memory loss, apathy, and inability to manage daily routines. Progression can occur in stages that are connected to the infarctions and the loss of that brain tissue. Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease. This is a rapidly progressive form of dementia caused by infection by a prion. Some cases show a family incident, a defect in the human prion protein gene, and some have been iatrogenic, meaning it's caused by some outside treatment like surgery, corneal transplant, or some invasive procedure. Most cases are sporadic. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is more common in older people. It has a long incubation period, after which the introduction to the brain, we start to see more abnormal prions being produced here. This is followed by rapid destruction of neurons and formation of plaques and vacuoles in the neuron. and is referred to as spongiform encephalopathy because it puts these empty spaces or these holes in the neurons. Signs and symptoms, early indicators are memory loss, behavioral changes, motor dysfunction, progressive dementia. EEG and MRI studies help diagnose. Dementia is common in the later stages of AIDS or acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. This virus invades brain tissue and can be exacerbated by other infectious agents, including candida or toxoplasmosis species, and by tumors like lymphomas. Gradual loss of memory and cognitive ability and impaired motor function are typical. So we'll see ataxia, weakness, abnormal reflexes. In children with congenital human immunodeficiency virus infection, the brain is affected frequently, causing intellectual delay and delay motor development. All right, under mental disorders, first we're going to talk about schizophrenia. The symptoms of schizophrenia can be grouped as positive, such as delusions, bizarre behavior, or negative, known as flat emotions or decreases in speech. Generally, disorganized thought processes occur in these clients. Communication is often impaired by inadequate language skills. Here we'll have lack of appropriate association of thoughts, or we may see a meaningless repetition of words or thoughts, or development of new words that don't have an accepted meaning, known as neologisms. We can also have delusions, false beliefs, and ideas of grandiose or delusions. Schizophrenia is usually treated by antipsychotic drugs, which affect the movement in the body, mostly that extrapyramidal activity. So you'll see involuntary muscle spasms in the face, the neck of the arms, chewing, grimacing, jerky movements. Some side effects can be reduced through the use of anti-Parkinson's agents and psychotherapy or psychosocial rehab. Depression is classified as a mood disorder. There are several groups of it. Major depression or unipolar disorder is an endogenous type of depression. Diagnosis is usually based on factors or personal characteristics. Etiologic factors can include things like genetic, developmental, and psychosocial stressors. Bipolar would involve alternating periods of depression and mania. Depression can also occur as an exogenous or reactive episode to some life event or secondary to systemic disorders like cancer, diabetes, heart failure, and systemic lupus erythematosus. Depression is classified as an affective mood disorder based on the characteristics of disorganized emotions. It results from decreased activity by the excitatory neurotransmitters, norepinephrine and serotonin in the brain. The exact mechanism is not known. The depressed client will often have a history of major psychosocial trauma that contributes to the development. Depression is indicated by prolonged periods of sadness, marked by hopelessness and inability to find pleasure in any activity. The person will have a lack of energy, loss of self-esteem, and that interferes with daily activity. Some people may be irritable and agitated, have difficulty concentrating or solving problems. Sleep disorders like insomnia or excessive sleep usually accompany depression. Loss of appetite and libido are often common as well. So treatment, counseling combined with antidepressants, SSRIs, which we're giving the serotonin to try to increase serotonin levels, or serotonin norepinephrine to try to increase both levels since both can contribute to the depression. Tricyclic antidepressants, those are usually only given when the serotonin reuptake inhibitors or the serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors don't work. And then also monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Again, these are usually given only when other things don't work. Electroconvulsive therapy, which is like shocking the brain, this can be used also for severe depression and is still used in the world. Panic attacks are common, but they don't necessarily lead to panic disorder. Panic disorder and anxiety disorder can develop when panic attacks are frequent or prolonged. Genetic factors have been identified. Increases in discharge of neurons can occur in the temporal lobes. Biochemical abnormalities involving neurotransmitters norepinephrine, serotonin, and GABA can also be involved. These patients are fearful of having another panic attack, and this can lead to increased irritability of the limbic system. Repeated episodes of intense fear without provocation can last for minutes or hours. Palpitations or tachycardia, hyperventilation, sweating, sensations of choking or smothering, and nausea typically accompany the feeling of terror here. These patients anticipate attacks and can develop a fear of open spaces known as agoraphobia, or fear of being a place where no help is available, and may refuse to leave their home as a result. Treatment would be psychotherapy, drug therapy, anti-anxiety agents, and antidepressants. The vertebrae are separated by cartilaginous discs, which act as cushions and help provide some flexibility to the spinal column. But sometimes spinal cord problems can occur. Herniation involves protrusion of the nucleus pulposus, the inner gelatinous component of the intervertebral disc, through a tear in the annulus fibrosus, the tough outer covering of that disc. If there is a protrusion into the extradural space, it can exert pressure on the spinal nerve or the spinal cord at the site and interfere with the conduction of the nerves. The tear in the capsule can also occur suddenly or gradually. Depending on which site is involved, sensory, motor, or autonomic function can be impaired. The most common location is lumbosacral discs at L4, L5, or L5 to S1. Some herniations involve cervical discs between C5 and C7. If pressure on the nerve tissue or the blood supply is prolonged, severe permanent damage to the nerve can result. So this is your picture of your herniated disc. Okay, take a look at it. Degenerative changes in the intravertebral disc usually come from things like age, metabolic changes, obesity. Herniation is usually caused by trauma or poor body mechanics causing excessive stress on the muscle. For example, improper lifting or transferring of patients. Trauma accounts for about 50% of the disc herniations. Signs would depend on the location and extent, and in most cases the effects are unilateral. Large protrusions may cause bilateral effects. Because of the pressure on the sensory nerves in the dorsal root, the lumbosacral herniation causes pain in the lower back that radiates down to the posterior aspect of one or both legs and can result in sciatica nerve pain. Paresthesia or numbness and tingling may occur if nerve compression is extensive. Muscle weakness develops with and we can have interference with urination, bladder emptying can also develop here. A herniated disc in the cervical region causes pain in the neck and the shoulder that radiates down the arm. Sensory impairment can reduce neck movement and weakness that accompanies the pain. The pressure can lead to skeletal muscle spasms in the neck or the back and further increase the pain. Myelography with contrast dye, CT scans, and MRI can confirm the herniation. And treatment would be things like weight bearing, reduction, rest as needed, application of heat, ice, traction, drugs to help release the muscle spasms, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, and surgery in cases of lumpectomy, in cases where we could do a laminectomy or a discectomy or a spinal fusion. And that concludes this lecture.